It was November 20th, 2019, and the helicopter circled far above in the freezing wind of the Antarctic. SCP Foundation Site Director Jason Monroe looked down at the isolated above-ground facilities of Provisional Site 344-1. Something about this place made him nervous, edgy, and for good reason. Between 2003 and 2019, 29 Mobile Task Force units and 73 members of D-Class personnel had gone missing here and never been found. Monroe thought he was here for a routine investigation into negligence and mismanagement, but little did he know, he was in for so much more. This is the story of SCP-5545 and one man's journey into his own worst nightmare, literally. But this nightmare began a long time ago, 300 years to be exact. And like most nightmares, it started as a dream. That dream was one of expansion. National powers across Europe wanted to be the first to conquer the globe and expand into new territories, and sent countless exploratory missions off into the unknown to achieve this goal. Any history book will tell you that the first outsiders to lay eyes upon the continent of Antarctica did so in 1820. The reality is that the first ones to get there actually landed in the late 1700s. The hapless explorers ventured into mainland Antarctica and made base camps. Before searching and digging for any useful resources nearby, they came upon a strange discovery. A hallway hidden beneath the ice. Not a passage in the ice, but a true hallway, complete with light fixtures. The confused explorers ventured down into these impossible hallways, and for many of them, it would be the last thing they ever did. No matter how long they walked, it seemed like the hallways just kept going. As they continued to walk for hours, they hoped to find something, anything, and eventually, they did. They passed from these hallways into somewhere different altogether, and most of them were never heard from again. Those who did manage to escape often died or took their own lives soon after. Whatever it was they discovered down there, they didn't want to live with it on their minds. It's believed that over 70 colonial explorers disappeared or died this way, and that most who found these endless hallways beneath the Antarctic ice never returned. The multiple anomalous objects and phenomena that make up SCP-5545 came into the Foundation's hands several centuries later, on September 18, 2003, when during an expedition into the Antarctic, they too found the endless hallways. The Foundation built Provisional Site 344-1 around them, hoping to safely seal them off from any other unwitting Antarctic explorers or researchers. But there was something else lurking beneath the ice in Antarctica, something dangerous. The hallways were designated as SCP-5545-1 and were thought to be the extent of the anomalous activity at the site. But soon SCP-5545-2 was discovered, which resulted in the deaths of 16 researchers. So what exactly is 5545-2? It's an entity so volatile that even knowing about it is considered to be a containment breach. And as a result, it's kept in Provisional Site 344-2. Unlike Site 344-1, 344-2 isn't a physical space. It's conceptual, accessible only through the endless hallways, created with the express purpose of keeping 5545-1 and 5545-2 separate. Why? Because whenever the two come into contact, the result is 5545-3, the network of endless hallways expanding. If they remained in contact, the hallways would continue to expand and the entire planet could be filled with endless hallways in just 4 to 6 hours. While the two are apart though, 5545-3 reverses, but it always would take just a few hours to throw the whole world into a chaos of infinite hallways. SCP-5545 has been given the classification safe. Wait, we're dealing with a mysterious and volatile anomaly that claimed a huge number of lives and still somehow eludes true Foundation understanding, yet the official SCP Foundation classification is safe? How could this be? Monroe was the director of Site-58 and was the definition of no nonsense. Prior to taking the site director position, he was a decorated member of Mobile Task Force Eta-10 and helped contain numerous Keter-class anomalies. He'd been around the proverbial block when it came to anomalous activity, and something about SCP-5545 and the management of Provisional Site 344 seemed awfully suspicious to him, and he had questions. Like how such an unpredictable anomaly could be declared safe, And why had there been such a lapse of communication between the Foundation and Dr. Gabriel Reed, who'd been running the facility for the past 2 decades? And most of all, just what exactly was the mysterious SCP-5545-2? Monroe started to believe that something terrible had happened at the site, and Reed was covering it all up. But to find out for sure, he'd need to go to Antarctica and investigate it himself. Information about this supposedly safe anomaly was highly classified. Those without O5 clearance could face termination for snooping. But that didn't scare Jason Monroe. He dealt with Ketters before. He could deal with this. Or so he thought. Monroe submitted a request and was granted unanimous approval by the O5 Council to travel to Provisional Site 344 and get to the bottom of this mystery. He took a chopper to the base soon after, armed with a concealed firearm and a hostile meme detector, or HMD, to test whether the base and its staff had somehow fallen under a hazardous mimetic effect from SCP-5545. He'd find the answers, or die trying. The moment Monroe arrived, he couldn't help but notice the strange way the staff behaved. They seemed listless, almost oppressive. When he showed his credentials to a researcher, they simply said, SCP-5545-2 is contained in Site 344-2. His request to see Dr. Reed that night was denied. Dr. Reed was busy, he was told. Wait until tomorrow. The next day, Dr. Monroe met with Dr. Reed, but the results of the meeting were underwhelming to say the least. Just like the rest of the staff on the site, he seemed exhausted, as though he hadn't slept in days. His responses were quiet and evasive, and he refused to tell Monroe anything that wasn't in the official files already. Monroe ran the conversation through the HMD and found nothing out of the ordinary. What was going on here? Monroe was irritated, but not deterred. Nothing would stop him from finding out the truth. The next day, he flexed his O5 credentials and hacked into the base's security system. This gave him access to cameras around Site 344-1, but more importantly, there was a single camera inside the mysterious Site 344-2. Jackpot. But when he looked at it, the feed was an entirely black screen with the words SCP-5545-2 is contained in Site 344-2. The footage of the staff in 344-1 was equally strange. The 18 employees on site all sat at computer banks, with nothing but static playing on their screens. Monroe kept digging though, and was able to hack into the security footage of Dr. Reed's office. As he watched, he discovered a 15-minute period where Reed left the office each day. He could use this brief window to break in and collect more intel on SCP-5545-2. Monroe was so wrapped up in the investigation that he almost forgot the more immediate danger around him and nearly wandered into one of the endless hallways of 5545-1 by mistake. He made a note to be more careful in the future. His first attempt at breaking into Dr. Reed's office didn't produce many answers. One piece of evidence was a blurry picture of what looked like a mobile task force entering a 5545-1 hallway in the dark. Another was a spreadsheet featuring all the personnel, living or dead, who worked at the site, but one name, and the details of whether this person was alive or dead, was completely redacted. Anything particularly juicy was hidden behind O5 clearance. If Monroe wanted the answers, he needed to break through. That night, he had a horrific reoccurring nightmare, one that had plagued him since he joined MTF ETA 10. He dreamed that he was in a fancy dining room with a grand fireplace. The room was full of statues of men and women. The men looked angry, and the women looked afraid. As he approached the fireplace, the ceiling extended infinitely up into the darkness. Suddenly, the zombie-like body of a teenage girl appears in the fireplace, hanging from a long thread. Her eyes look furious and full of rage, and Monroe somehow knows that he's the reason for her hate. When he steps into the fireplace in this dream, she attacks him. The two intertwine, and they burn forever. The one difference was that in this new iteration of the dream, he blinked upon entering the fireplace, and suddenly he was in the hallway. He awoke sure that something was terribly wrong here, but he couldn't give up now. The next day, Dr. Monroe broke into Reed's office and made a horrifying discovery. He found files indicating that Dr. Reed was knowingly sending mobile task forces and D-class personnel into the infinite hallways of 5545-1 to their doom. He also found evidence that Reed and the researchers had been spying on him, somehow intercepting copies of the notes he had been taking. That's when Dr. Reed entered the office and interrupted him. Monroe panicked and drew his weapon, holding the doctor at gunpoint. He was breaking so many Foundation rules, but right now, he feared for his life. The doctor seemed unbothered by Monroe's threats though. He told Monroe that everything was going to plan, and that he should go back to his room. Monroe was becoming increasingly paranoid. He felt that at any moment guards might burst in and execute him. Nothing about this place made sense. He worried he was going insane. Perhaps the only way to find answers was to go even deeper, to risk it all, and venture through the endless hallways to find SCP-5545-2 himself, and finally discover what this thing actually was. Monroe left his room and stepped into one of the endless hallways of 5545-1 that was located just across from his dorm. He found that it was a hallway like all the others on site, plain, concrete, worn of age, with simple light fixtures on the walls. He walked for hours, recording with a concealed device. The lights suddenly went out, leaving him in complete darkness. When they flicked back on, he was in a very different environment. A grand old carpeted hallway, the kind you'd see in an old mansion. He broke into a cold sweat. What was so familiar about this place? He kept walking, racked with terror, until this new hallway finally led him to the place he'd been seeking, Site 344-2, the domain of 5545-2. It was a large, poorly lit room, filled with grimacing statues and a large fireplace at the far end. It was the exact same room from Monroe's dream, with one horrifying difference. Monroe noticed a single white thread hanging down from the infinite ceiling, and when he looked up to find its source, he screamed. There were hundreds of bodies hanging and swinging from the ceiling above him. Everyone who SCP-5545-2 had ever killed, including MTF members, D-Class personnel, and even the colonial explorers from hundreds of years before. And all of them were him, every single one. They had his face, and there, hanging in the middle of the room at ground level, was the body of a teenage girl, the one from his dream. In that moment, he finally recognized her. She was the girl he killed, the first him, hundreds of years ago. Much like Monroe, you're probably wondering, what is going on here? Thanks to declassified communication between Dr. Reed and the O5 Council, we can tell you. Jason Monroe is a man who's been reincarnated hundreds of times over the last 300 years, ever since he murdered a teenage girl, a girl named Emily, his daughter. This murder sparked the existence of SCP-5545 as an eternally reoccurring punishment for his crimes. Since figuring this out, the Foundation has kept tabs on Monroe's reincarnations, whether they're MTF members, D-Class personnel, or even site directors. They see to it that these reincarnations always find their way back to 5545-2 to take his punishment and prevent the infinite hallway expansion that threatens to destroy the world. It's a plan everyone is in on, everyone except him. But every time he enters that nightmare-haunting room, it all comes rushing back. In that moment, though, he knew his crime, and he somehow knew how many times this punishment had unfolded for him. He now had two choices: repent and accept the punishment again, or leave and activate 5545-3, potentially allowing the endless tunnels to expand across the world. Like his many predecessors, Monroe made the decent choice. He accepted his punishment and allowed his own string to coil around him as the lights in the room went off, one by one, leaving only darkness. Jason Monroe, that version of him, at least, was never seen again. But the SCP Foundation is already eyeing up his next reincarnation and preparing to let this twisted cycle play out all over again. The whole earth seemed to rumble beneath him as Carlos Garcia stood there, standing up at the hulking, shadowy mass towering over him. His knees were shaking, and sweat was running down his face, but he clenched his jaw and stayed put. Furious voices hurled abuse at him from all angles. The stench of gasoline and wood smoke filled the air as the rumbling grew louder and louder. Gripping the camcorder tightly, Carlos pointed it straight up at the enormous excavator that was belching out smoke just feet away from him. Angry men in high-visibility jackets hung off the sides of it, making hand gestures at him and even throwing rocks. But Carlos found, much to his surprise, that his filming hand was steady. He panned the lens across the view in front of him. Excavators, lumberjacks, standing on cut-down tree trunks as thick as motorcycles, and then up into the lush canopies of the Amazon rainforest with its rich, dark green leaves, dense knotted vines, colorful fruits, and terrified ecosystem. Colorful birds watched the scene with nervous eyes, ready to take off at a moment's notice. All of the larger animals had either run away or been killed long before he showed up. Carlos swung the camcorder back down to the mercenaries chopping down his beloved rainforest and jabbed a finger at them.
You will not put your axe to the trunk of one more tree without first cutting me down!
Sick of waiting, the workmen climbed back into their vehicles and started revving their engines. It was all for show, Carlos told himself. That's all it was. They were just trying to scare him, but it was working. He was scared. The excavator in front of him crept slowly forward with tires that were taller than he was. A foot away, 6 inches away, and then an inch away. Carlos closed his eyes and readied himself to be run over, but the pain never came. A whining, chewing noise came from the engine, as if the vehicle was suddenly trapped on something, unable to turn its wheels. Carlos opened his eyes and tried to peer around the edge of the vehicle to see what was going on at the back. There was a new note in the voices of the workmen around him. They didn't seem so angry anymore, more fearful. Carlos went to take a step to see what was going on, but his foot caught and he was trapped. Looking down, he saw that he had somehow managed to lodge his foot beneath a small tree root. He tried to pull himself free, but the grip tightened. All of a sudden, the roots wound tightly around his boots, instantly crushing his foot and breaking every bone inside of it. Carlos screamed, but through the dullness of terror that was filling his mind, he realized no one else would hear him because they were all too busy screaming themselves. The root wasn't just tightening around his foot, now it was pulling him, dragging him. The dirt parted around his crushed foot as the root dragged him down into the earth. It wasn't that the ground was swallowing him. It was that the root was pulling so hard that the ground broke apart around his body. The pressure was unbelievable as first his ankle, then his knee, and then his hip went under. He felt the bones in his pelvis crunching and breaking as his other leg was forced into an unnatural split. It would be good to tell you that Carlos Garcia had a quick death from that point, that he felt no pain as his body was wrenched down into the earth. But no, he died very slowly, in a tremendous amount of fear and pain, as his lungs steadily filled up with earth, and his bones splintered and crunched one by one. One of the most admirable traits of the human race has always been our ability to find a home anywhere. From the Inuit people living in the Arctic Circle, all the way through to the ancient Egyptians building colossal pyramids in the middle of arid deserts, humanity always finds a way to make a home. Anthropologists can look all over the world and find traces of human settlements virtually anywhere. One of the remaining bastions where tribal populations can still exist and flourish is the Amazon rainforest. Life can be difficult and fiercely competitive, but the rich, fertile ground and abundance of food sources have meant that the Amazon has always been home to small human settlements. That is why researchers were so perplexed by the existence of a dark spot within the rainforest. After decades of work, not one trace of human life has been found within this area. For good reason. For a very good reason. Foundation agent Natalie Richards made her way quickly down the stairs, spiraling downwards and downwards. She had never much enjoyed the descent. Something about waking up in the morning and knowing that she would wind up back down here again went beyond the usual Monday blues. It was more insidious. She had barely slept all week. It wasn't just the sticky heat of the barracks at the Paragon South America Forward Operating Site that kept her awake. It was the paranoia. She would just lie there in her bed, experiencing these delusions that at any point, a root would shoot up out of the ground and wrap itself around her neck. It never happened, of course. Their accommodations had been built high up, suspended among the trees away from the site to mitigate any risk. But still, it would always get worse when it was her turn on the observation deck. Down and down she descended through the tower, feeling that horrible, pressurizing feeling that tells you you're going further underground. The air she was breathing down here was filtered by enormous top-of-the-line systems that made sure the air within the tower was clean and fresh. There was an entire department dedicated to the filtration system set up in each of the 4 towers. And yet, she couldn't help imagining that tendrils of fog creeping through the vents to get to her. Suddenly, she was there on the observation deck. She hadn't had time to brace herself, so the view, even though she had seen it dozens of times before, punched her right in the stomach and left her feeling dizzy. On the other side of the glass was a void. The research team had told her that it was 53 kilometers across at its widest point and 42 kilometers at its deepest. Those kinds of numbers meant nothing to her. The reality was that it was darkness, a rotten abyss, open and unending. She was in Tower Charlie, one of 4 observation towers suspended upside down from the roof of the cavern. At the bottom of the tower, what usually would have been the top, was the searchlight. Its beam cut steadily through the abyss like a lighthouse in the dead of night. The beam drifted through empty space. The only way you could even tell it was lit up was the slight haze in the air. Suddenly, the searchlight found its target. Just a branch at first, nothing thicker than a car, snaking its way to join with another and another, growing thicker by multitudes each time, until suddenly the light was shining on the trunk, 380 meters in diameter, 9.2 kilometers tall. The colossal tree hung upside down from the roof of the void, dangling into the abyss. Natalie Richards gulped and tried to breathe deeply so as not to lose her balance. It was her job now to stare at this tree for the next 3 hours. She felt sick. SCP-6666 is a colossal botanical entity that can be found near the coordinates 4 degrees 51 minutes 29.4 seconds south by 67 degrees 44 minutes 12.6 seconds west in the Amazon rainforest. Research has been ongoing for several years to fully map and understand the scale of both the tree itself and the void in which it inhabits. Project Paragon was instituted in an attempt to understand and one day contain the growth of this entity. Above ground, an exclusion zone has been set up covering the area where the roots of this tree have grown through to the surface. A 1-kilometer buffer has been established just outside of the circumference, with a heavily armed security presence patrolling it at all times. Unfortunately, due to the nature of SCP-6666, this buffer zone has to be moved on a normal weekly basis. While samples taken from this SCP seem to indicate that it is totally dead, organically speaking, the root system still possesses a degree of autonomy, being able to move and grow at rates unseen in typical plant species. The roots are capable of breaking through the surface and constricting organic life living above, primarily targeting humans, but also targeting buildings, vehicles, and machinery. It is no wonder then that there is no trace of any human settlements, either contemporary or historical, anywhere near SCP-6666. She knew that the Foundation has been at a loss for progress over the prior few months. Their equipment and resources were deteriorating faster than they were making progress with their research. No one had been down to the floor yet. They were all too afraid to. Descending down through the void, Agent Richard saw something that made her heart drop. Out of the gap in the trunk of SCP-6666 emerged a hand. It clung to the bark with enormous fingers, straining and pulling as the entity dragged itself out from its hiding place. Arm after arm emerged, with one carrying a spear that must have been 20 meters long. 5 arms in total clung to the tree as SCP-6666-A surveyed the vehicle flying past it. The entity didn't swipe at the VTOL. It didn't do anything to attack it, but it just watched before slowly turning its face towards Agent Richards in the observation tower. It had 6 eyes arranged into columns running down the length of its face. It had no nose, no mouth, and no ears, but it saw her. It saw her even better than she could see it. She felt panic rising in her chest. Meanwhile, the research team and the VTOL checked their equipment one more time. They had been outfitted with a brand new set of custom pressurized insertion suits, but they weren't stupid. Nothing was 100% safe from reach, and having studied the fog down here for month after month, they knew just how deadly it could be if there was even the slightest contamination. Down and down, the craft descended kilometer after kilometer through utter blackness, until through the front window, they were able to see a thick layer of fog coating the basement of the cabin. The lead researcher stood at the front of the VTOL and gave them one more briefing, emphasizing the importance of moving slowly and safely. not touching anything that could compromise the integrity of their suits, and making sure to collect as many physical samples as possible to take back up to the surface for study. Agent Richards stared at the demon in front of her. Even through the very enforced glass, she could hear the low rumbling of its voice as it spoke to her. Researchers have been trying to understand what language it was for years now, but with no luck. It was either so ancient or so alien that it was beyond their ability to translate. The entity had a name, however. From speaking to researchers on Project Paragon adjacent to SCP-4840, they have been able to name the creature, the Demon Hector, one of 4 primeval entities originating from a long-since lost near-human civilization, millions of years old at least. Who knows? It may even predate the existence of Earth entirely. Of course, we can't simply mention the concept of 4 primeval demons without telling you a little bit about the other 3, some of which you might even recognize. One of them, known as SCP-2254 to the SCP Foundation, is also known as the Demon Lahire. Much like Hector, Lahire is a 6-eyed being of immense power, presiding over his own domain. He is invisible to the naked eye and spends his free time influencing the minds of human beings, when he's not impregnating them with fleshy masses. Next comes the entity known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-4840-B, also known as the Demon Lancelot. Once a brave knight of King Cyrus VIII von Apollyon before being corrupted, this immensely powerful being resides in SCP-4840, the flying city of Autopopodopolis. And rounding out this elite group of mysterious demonic entities comes SCP-6765-D, also known as the Demon Ogier, a horrific cloaked entity that sits atop a throne of blood. It's widely believed these 4 entities were cursed by an unknown and immensely powerful thaumatological being long ago, doomed to hide in ancient places and live until they fulfill their true purpose, playing a part in some known event that will someday compromise all of mankind. And now, Agent Richards was face to face with 1/4 of the apocalypse. Agent Richards stared as the Demon Hector spoke to her. Dozens of kilometers below, the VTOL touched down in the fog. As soon as the deployment doors opened, the thick gas filled the aircraft, obscuring their vision. Turning on their helmet cameras, the researchers stepped out into the unknown as their live feeds were watched by their colleagues on the surface. Smooth stone surfaces covered with etchings swam into view. Some kind of ancient language carved into stone? The remnants of some early South American civilization? No, the researchers on the surface knew immediately that what they were looking at was far too advanced, far too old. Was it? Was it even human at all? A scream filled the control room. A breach in a researcher's suit. The fog that he breathed in contained just a few particles, set the neurons in his brain on fire before shutting down his nervous system entirely in a matter of seconds. The rest of the researchers all ran back to the VTOL in fear, but the fog around them was so dense that they couldn't find it anywhere. It could have been 3 feet away from them, and they would have never even known. One by one, the researchers in the foggy forest dropped dead. On the surface, the research team sighed and closed the video feeds. There was a reason they'd sent them down with live cameras. No one had really expected them to return. And all the while, Agent Natalie Richards stood trembling and watching as the Demon Hector hung from the upside-down tree and chanted at her in his impossible language. She didn't care what any of the botanists said. This tree was not dead. The demon readied its spear and leaped at her. Foundation researcher Marcus Hernandez was a professional in all aspects of his job. He was intelligent, being scouted for a job at the Foundation right out of college. He was brave, unyielding in the faces of the horrifying creatures and dangerous situations that working with the anomalous practically guaranteed. But most importantly, researcher Hernandez was cautious. He not only knew that keeping his hands at a fair distance from any newly discovered anomalous objects was a safe way to keep his head, he was also aware that it was sometimes better to take risks that would further his knowledge about an anomaly and how best to contain it. Sometimes those risks came with a price, like being part of the first team to study a recently discovered anomaly. To researcher Hernandez, it was better to lose the lives of the ones working to protect humanity from what lies in the dark than have any unsuspecting civilians stumble upon something potentially life-threatening. That's why he and his team took the assignment of studying SCP-1437 before anyone else in the Foundation was able to. They simply were not sure of what it was capable of, and researcher Hernandez's known attention to detail and cautious nature could best help the Foundation not only establish proper containment procedures, but also ensure that their own personnel were safe while doing so. As researcher Hernandez sat in the back of a jeep that rolled and tumbled over the arid landscape of the Mojave Desert, he reviewed what the Foundation knew about the anomaly. Unfortunately, it wasn't much. For starters, it was a 3-meter by 3-meter hole in the ground, originally thought to be an ordinary cave. As a result of its deceiving appearance, the anomaly went unnoticed for decades, until the Foundation picked up on a local story that was the talk of the town for a small group of camping and hiking hobbyists in Nevada. A camper, while out exploring and trekking through the dry dunes of the Mojave, was struck in the back of the neck with a U.S. quarter. While the object by itself is harmless, it came flying at the camper's body at an incredibly high speed, shooting from a large hole in the ground and striking hard enough to break the skin and wedge itself inside the camper's neck. After reaching the local hospital and getting the coin removed, it still left a small scar across the back of the camper's head. This unusual event prompted Foundation reconnaissance, which turned out to be entirely warranted, as observation of the surrounding area found several more objects buried around the area that were believed to have emerged from the hole, now designated as SCP-1437. A small canoe decorated with luminescent patterns, a calculator that added and subtracted letters instead of numbers, and a rotten apple core were all objects strewn around the immediate area. And if that's not strange enough, attempts to map out the hole failed, as all measuring equipment was lost after reaching a certain depth. Before the initial observation team picked up and left, SCP-1437 shot out large quantities of rock and dirt for over an hour, confirming that objects emerged from the hole at high speeds. Chemical analysis of the objects found around the area showed that they were composed of materials either unknown or not commonly found on Earth to warrant use in mass production. The observation team came up with a hypothesis. SCP-1437 was a hole that led to a parallel universe, and the objects it shot out originated in said location. Researcher Hernandez knew that this was just a hypothesis, but he had reviewed the lab results himself. Those objects certainly did not come from anywhere on Earth, and if the hole functioned as a gateway between worlds, that could explain why the measuring equipment was lost after a certain point. The jeep came to a stop, and when researcher Hernandez stepped out, he came face to face with SCP-1437, a large hole sitting in the Mojave Desert. His crew was already hard at work, surveying and excavating the surrounding area for any other objects the hole had shot out that had been lost to time. A mobile analysis lab tent was set up in the distance, as well as several trailers for personnel living on site. Researcher Hernandez's personal decision to not use D-Class personnel in his research meant that each risk the SCP-1437 team took had to be calculated differently. They wouldn't send a person into the hole and risk loss of life when a drone could serve the same function without the potential drawbacks. But still, the initial observation team lost all of their equipment while trying to measure SCP-1437's depth. Why waste an expensive drone when the result would most likely turn out the same? It was these decisions that earned Hernandez's fame and respect at the Foundation, and over the next few weeks, his team was able to develop a wide knowledge base regarding SCP-1437 and establish safe containment procedures to keep the anomaly hidden from the public and easy to work with for Foundation personnel. First, a 2-meter-tall electric fencing unit was built around the perimeter of SCP-1437. This fence would not only keep unwanted trespassers out, but also had defensive capabilities due to the harmful electrical charge it could emit upon contact with an object. Groups of 3 security guard personnel were assigned to patrol this fence at all times, and they were instructed to deal with any trespassers through standard Foundation protocol. They would be taken into custody, interrogated, and as long as they were unaware of SCP-1437's anomalous properties, given a healthy dose of amnestics and released back into the general public. Anything that emerged from SCP-1437, be it a physical object or a living organism, would be cataloged by the Foundation and tested immediately for any potential hazards before further analysis could begin. If found to be safe, the items would be studied as much as possible. If not, they were stowed away in an area intended to keep them contained until a safe way to examine them was found. But perhaps the most important containment procedure researcher Hernandez established was the forbiddance of testing with SCP-1437. Due to the anomaly's mysterious nature and incredibly likely potential connection to parallel universes, testing could have grave and unforeseen consequences. When dealing with alternate or parallel timelines or realities, the Foundation is incredibly cautious and only interacts in ways that they're absolutely sure will not have any unexpected damage on baseline reality. That, and researcher Hernandez wasn't exactly keen on attracting the attention of these parallel universes without a solid understanding of who and what they were. As he would come to find, this inclination proved to be beneficial. As the team observed SCP-1437, they documented a number of notable objects that emerged from the hull, each supposedly originating from a parallel world. The first of which, however, was not anything the team hadn't seen before. The initial observation team sent to test whether SCP-1437 was actually anomalous had observed the hull emitting a mass of rock and dirt. For over an hour, SCP-1437 spewed earthen materials without stopping, filling the surrounding areas with debris. Since this was before the research team theorized the hull was connected to parallel realities, they weren't sure what to make of it. Was it a natural eruption? A poorly documented earthquake that somehow sent chunks of rock and dirt to the surface and shooting out of the hole? Though somewhat stumped, researcher Hernandez's team eventually came to a single solid conclusion. If SCP-1437 led to a parallel world or worlds, whoever was on the other side of the hole may have been attempting to fill it using natural materials. If they were attempting to fill it, could they be trying to contain it? Did the parallel world on the other side of SCP-1437 have its own foundation? This sudden thought gave researcher Hernandez pause and made him reconsider his hands-off approach to SCP-1437. Should his team attempt to contact whoever was on the other side? If it was a parallel branch of the Foundation, this behavior would be encouraged. The Foundation communicated with alternate versions of itself in time and space all of the time. The Department of Temporal Anomalies was built around this premise. But these were exceptions, not the rules. And communication with alternate foundations was always carried out with utmost safety and precaution. It was only done when there was a certainty that risk would be avoided. Researcher Hernandez was sure he made the correct decision, and he would stray away from attempting to contact those on the other side of the anomaly, even if they were another world's incarnation of the SCP Foundation. Weeks later, researcher Hernandez was awoken in the middle of the night by an excited assistant who, after calming herself down, informed him that SCP-1437 had spat out a new object. You have to forgive her. If you were out in the desert for weeks staring at a hole waiting for it to do something and it eventually did it, you'd be pretty excited too. When researcher Hernandez ran outside to see what the team was freaking out about, he could have jumped for joy too. SCP-1437 wasn't spitting out rocks and dirt anymore. This time, it was a map, clearly illustrated to depict the continent of North America. But upon closer inspection, the team noticed some very apparent differences from a traditional map in the geography of our world. The map was written entirely in Spanish, and the names of countries and states it listed didn't match their existing counterparts. In fact, the entire borderlines of the map were mismatched, out of place, and radically different from anything resembling North America. It listed the government of the entire continent of North America as La República Popular de Aguas Nuevas, or when translated to English, the People's Republic of New Waters. This exciting find was logged and archived, and it was only the first of a series of objects that emerged from SCP-1437. A few days later, another object was documented. This time, it was a photograph. After initial scans determined the object to be safe to view, not harboring any dangerous mimetic triggers upon viewing or anything of that nature, the team analyzed the picture to the best of their abilities. They saw a breathtaking vista of a city skyline, unlike anything possible on this world. Intertwined with buildings were massive structures that appeared to be made out of coral. They wrapped around skyscrapers, branching from the ground and sometimes emerging from the buildings themselves. The coral broke through the tops of the tallest buildings, putting the man-made titans to shame. In the far background, a massive flying creature can be seen peacefully floating through the air. This otherworldly visual overwhelmed the team, but after the initial shock wore down, a keen-eyed junior researcher pointed out that many of the buildings resembled known landmarks, though they were radically altered in noticeable ways. This wasn't just any city. It was New York City, only this time with coral and giant floating creatures. Exactly what the Big Apple's been missing this entire time. But this was still comprehensible and understandable for the Foundation. SCP-1437's true weirdness was still yet to come. A few days after the photograph emerged, SCP-1437 shot out a truly peculiar find. Researcher Hernandez and his team were stumped as to what its purpose was and what it signified, but they determined the objects to be completely safe and archived them regardless. The items in question were a series of discs made from solid gold, varying in size but never being obscenely large. Accompanying the disc was a sheet of paper that read, "Please send more rain." The Foundation was understandably puzzled. One working theory researcher Hernandez put together was that whoever was on the opposite side of SCP-1437 was paying tribute to the whole as a form of worship and was asking the almighty beings on the other side to send more rain for whatever reason. While the Foundation didn't exactly send the rain over themselves, whoever sent that request was probably pleased when a thunderstorm the next week sent torrents of rainwater into SCP-1437. We hope they're happy. The most notable discoveries that emerged from SCP-1437 occurred over a multi-year period. Previously, the research team theorized that SCP-1437 was connected to a single reality, and that whoever was on the other side of it was sending objects through, either by chance or by means of communication. This discovery proved that there wasn't just one parallel world connecting to SCP-1437, but many, an unknown amount, in fact. The items in question this time weren't just objects, but human cadavers. One by one over the years, interspersed between the various oddities that SCP-1437 also spat out were human corpses, dead on arrival. The bodies were clad in Foundation-issue D-Class uniforms, though with some slight variations. This proved that the worlds connected to SCP-1437 were, in fact, alternate versions of the Foundation, or at least some of the worlds, as there was no way to tell who, what, or where the objects that emerged from SCP-1437 came from. Researcher Hernandez and his team examined the bodies with care and determined that they were dead long before they hit the ground, and that the gateway between worlds triggered the cause of death as they traveled between realities. Inside the D-Class jumpsuits, the team discovered pieces of paper, manuscripts that detailed their world's Foundation's documentation on SCP-1437. This deliberate inclusion of documentation signaled to the research team that there was an attempt at communication and cooperation from one world's Foundation to theirs. But why? The first body was clearly in adequate physical condition. It was protected due to being clothed in a pressure suit with an attached oxygen supply. The documentation read similarly to the SCP Foundation's documentation, though instead of special containment procedures and an object class, SCP-1437 was given a safety rating and safety containment procedures. These detail the Foundation that was giving civilians tours of their anomalies, where they could take photographs and even get close enough to view the anomaly from a close distance. The rest of the file was similar to what Hernandez's team recorded, and listed the following objects as those that emerged from SCP-1437. One small pyramid composed of concrete, large quantities of dirt and rocks, a landscape painting, believed to be a location in Scotland. According to the painting, its originating universe's sun is blue and its sky yellow. Several discs made from solid gold. Accompanying the discs was a sheet of paper reading, "Please stop plague." A photograph of several scientists. All scientists pictured have unusually long fingers, estimated to be nearly 25 centimeters long. A sheet of paper reading, "Thank you, please send more gifts." The file continued with a notice explaining that the bodies of orange jumpsuited individuals holding documentation of the anomaly emerged from the hole. The file's unfamiliarity with jumpsuits indicate that this world lacks a concept of D-Class personnel. The file mentions that, on the 15th of August 2012, a volunteer from the Foundation, Marco Perton, entered SCP-1437 wearing safety gear, taking with him a copy of this document. The second D-Class body examined by Hernandez's team was branded with the phrase, "Property of the SCP Corporation." The file described an item with a threat level of little, and a foundation that was more focused on profit than containment. After objects emerged from the hole, they were authorized to be sold to any interested collectors. Objects described by this version of the Foundation include a statue of what is believed to be a reptilian entity sporting numerous eyes and tails, large quantities of dirt and rocks, a glass bottle of water, a human femur covered in saliva, a cube comprised of several smaller cubes, all of which are different colors, purpose unknown, a soccer ball, ball only has 5 sides. The file included the SCP Corporation describing D-Class showing up, as they did in other worlds, and then the Corporation happily sending several D-Classes of their own through the hole in an attempt to communicate with whoever was on the other side. The third D-Class body examined was heavily bandaged and appeared to be blinded. There were lacerations on its arms and legs, and its tongue had been removed. The file described a foundation akin to a religious cult. SCP-1437 was given a heathen level of unforgivable, and its holding measures described a high priest having to bless the hole every 2 years, and the need to perform blood sacrifices into it to ward off any demons. The wild incarnation of the Foundation interpreted SCP-1437 as a portal to the underworld, and described a list of objects emerging from it. It read as follows: several discs made from solid gold. Accompanying the disc was a sheet of paper reading, "Please kill foes." Large quantities of dirt and rocks, believed to be an attempt by demons to harm the High Priest, who was present at the holding site at the time. The broken remains of a human arm, covered in saliva. A photograph of a metal bird flying away from a city. What appears to be a large mushroom is visible behind the bird, believed to be an attempt by demons at mocking us. A human eye which moved when touched, believed to be a lesser demon, was burnt immediately. Unlike the other worlds, when this one received D-Classes through SCP-1437, the religious fanatics believed the bodies to be demons wearing the skin of men, and threw the bodies back in the hole. The next D-Class body observed by Hernandez's team was the most curious. It was a heavily emaciated child, who had apparently been lobotomized. It described a foundation that sounds more like an organization out of a dystopian science fiction novel than anything else. The file spoke of a group of beings referred to as our masters above all, which the Foundation answered to. Any objects emerging from SCP-1437 were brought before the Masters. Any trespassers were interrogated by the Masters. This Foundation believed the objects SCP-1437 shot out were gifts for the Masters. Their list reads as follows: 1. Diamond. Large quantities of dirt and rocks. Bark from the extinct Quercus buckii, the lower half of a human body. Delivering to supervising servant of our Masters above. It is currently unknown how the gift sender was aware of the diet of our Masters above. A document was sent into SCP-1437 thanking the gift giver for the object and requesting further tributes to our Masters above. A bottle of human-intended wine. While they certainly enjoyed the food of the human body, the wine was clearly misinterpreted. For whatever reason, this Foundation interpreted the wine as an assassination attempt on the Masters above all. As a result, they sent a large, anomalously powered explosive through SCP-1437 and into the world of an unsuspecting Foundation. The file continues with a notice from this Foundation's O5-1 which reads, "This is a reminder of why we must be vigilant in our containment procedures. From now on, I don't want any of these gifts being taken out of containment. They are a clear and present danger to our Masters above." Looks like researcher Hernandez had the correct idea about not wanting to risk experimenting with SCP-1437. Attracting the attention of a reality where the almighty O5 Council answers to an even more powerful human-eating group of Masters above all? No thank you. This reality's Foundation is perfectly content alone. 36 hours. The SCP Foundation's digital doomsday clock ticks down as Foundation researchers scramble to salvage the biological functionality of the entity known as SCP-1514-1B. These 36 hours are all the time they have left in the world, and once that time is up, the planet Earth will be bombarded with a shower of deadly orbital lasers from SCP-1514-2 satellites. It will be an apocalyptic XK-class scenario, and it's now only 35 hours away. For those who aren't familiar with the way that the Foundation categorizes K-class scenarios or need to refresh their memory, XK class describes a scenario in which the human population of the planet is reduced to the point of no return. This could be because the destruction is so sudden and irreversible that no amount of preparation can mitigate it. With regards to the scenario that might occur due to the worst-case outcome of SCP-1514, the XK class label has been applied to indicate the grave nature of the threat it poses. Like the looming threat of nuclear Armageddon, a danger that SCP-1514 was in some ways conceived to combat, the fallout of the laser systems from the SCP-1514-2 satellites could even go a step beyond depopulation. The raw, unleashed force of the lasers could break the planet at its foundations, resulting in the untimely explosion of the Earth itself. It almost goes without saying, but the SCP Foundation's model of a normal reality is one that includes our home planet's continued existence. Due to the high probability of an XK-class scenario occurring if the device and satellites are not secured, contained, and protected, SCP-1514 has been given the object class designation of Keter. Its composite parts add up to a whole that is on par with the fictional space station of the Death Star from the obscure 70s sci-fi fantasy movie called Blue Harvest. Just kidding, the movie's title is Star Wars, also known as Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, and it's anything but obscure. A smash hit, all-ages adventure that forever changed the face of the Hollywood blockbuster. Alongside Steven Spielberg's Jaws a couple years earlier, Star Wars has become a ubiquitous part of pop culture, even as the intellectual property was passed from its creator George Lucas into the grubby mouse hands of the Disney Corporation. But before these now famous movies blasted off into a franchise, it was a trilogy of films that was completed in the 1980s. During the first term of the Reagan administration, it was no secret that the novelty of Star Wars, along with its super high-tech spaceships and space stations, were what caused the United States Department of Defense to invoke its name when referring to the Strategic Defense Initiative. President Reagan announced the beginning of the Star Wars program on March 23, 1983, stating that the United States would soon be able to surpass the current pinnacle of military technology, intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles. Being a man of the silver screen himself, former actor Ronald Reagan began a desperate journey to ensure that this secret service of the air could combat America's international squadron of enemies and prevent the impending murder in the air by studying new technology and weapons night unto night so that the American nation could be the winning team. Haha. But Ronald Reagan's hasty heart caused him to make the Star Wars program his million-dollar baby before any of the technology was verified, and naturally, accidents will happen. Oh, and by the way, SCP Explained would like to formally apologize for the amount of Ronald Reagan movie puns that were used in the previous section. Based on our understanding of the typical demographics of YouTube viewers, we're pretty sure that you never grew up on the classic films of Ronald Reagan. To most of you, he's probably just the wacky old president from the 80s, so if any of these references flew over your head, we understand. And speaking of flying over our heads, SCP-1514 was developed as an orbital satellite-based defense system that would rely on radio transmissions to direct the behavior of the spacecrafts. Though there were many failures during the Star Wars program's years of operation, it could almost be said that the speculative technologies that created SCP-1514 succeeded a bit too well. During the time it was active, the public details of the Strategic Defense Initiative showed an overly complex deterrent system that risked further escalation in an aggressive global arms race. Reagan's advocacy for it was met with harsh criticism, even prompting one senator to call Star Wars, quote, a fundamental assault on the concepts, alliances, and arms control agreements that have buttressed American security for several decades. And that senator's name was Joe Biden. Yes, that Joe Biden. In 1993, the Star Wars program was dissolved into the Missile Defense Agency, and the United States moved increasingly away from science fiction-inspired laser weaponry. SCP-1514 is an orphaned piece of technology from the Star Wars program, and also one that now falls under the jurisdiction of the SCP Foundation. During the brief window towards the tail of the 20th century that SCP-1514 was operational, it was referred to internally by the codename XYE, Xi. There were a series of bizarre malfunctions that resulted in its decommissioning, and the FBI became directly involved in the transfer of the unit to the Foundation's custody. even since its discovery in a secure bunker that has since been abandoned by the United States government, SCP-1514's ground console. SCP-1514-1A has been closely monitored for any signs of irregularity in its condition. SCP-1514-1A is a vaguely coffin-shaped steel device that is capable of sending extraterrestrial radio transmissions. It is outfitted with highly advanced life support systems that are meant to prolong the life of SCP-1514-1B, a seemingly organic life form that resides within the metallic confines of SCP-1514-1A. The health and status of SCP-1514-1B is conveyed to all observers through external displays, such as heart rate monitors and blood pressure valves. The entity itself is obscured by the opaque exterior of the container, and Foundation personnel are advised against any attempts to glimpse its true visage. Any action that could negatively impact the stable condition of SCP-1514-1B is met with immediate termination, and this includes trying to dislodge or modify any of the components of SCP-1514-1A. This is because normal function of SCP-1514-1B's homeostatic status is essential in order to avoid an XK-class scenario. Every hour on the hour, a radio transmission is sent from SCP-1514-1B to the nearest instance of SCP-1514-2, a series of defense satellites of which a currently undisclosable number exists. The anomalous properties of these radio transmissions allow them to bypass all forms of radiation stoppage, including Faraday cages. This is quite fortunate, as a prolonged break from these communications that go on for longer than 36 hours triggers the Xi defense system's so-called coronet contingency, a simultaneous deployment of laser weapons on countless preset targets around the globe. The SCP Foundation has found that at some point when SCP-1514 was outside the control of the United States government, the amount of targets as well as the destructive capability of the X-ray lasers was heavily expanded by further engineering. Though the identity of the parties responsible for the expansion of the Xi defense system is classified to everyone but Level 2 personnel and higher, the anomalous nature of the project has become apparent to all involved. As previously established, SCP-1514-1B is a living entity with a standard deviation of biological processes that maintain its life. Whether it is also the power source of SCP-1514-1A is unknown, but the energy provided seems to come from the unusual components within. A dark red fluid similar in color to hemoglobin has been noted as a major part of the life support functions within the device. The inner mechanisms of SCP-1514 are cybernetic and possesses autonomous agency, and this extends to the physical nature of all accessible SCP-1514-2 instances. Analysis of multiple SCP-1514-2 specimens has revealed that much of what appears to be expected pieces of any modern satellite, including the solar paneling, are actually decoys intended to camouflage the SCP-1514-2 instances as non-anomalous technology. The actual makeup of an SCP-1514-2 instance includes an internal power source of likewise anomalous and possibly biological origin. All attempts made by the SCP Foundation to deactivate the coronet contingency have been unsuccessful, as SCP-1514 seems unable to respond to any input from a source outside of itself. This is where calamity threatens to rear its ugly head. It has been several years since malfunctions have caused the Xi defense system to be taken out of commission, and now its internal components are at risk of contamination and failure. 35 hours. SCP-1514-1A fails to send its transmission to SCP-1514-2 for the first time since falling into Foundation custody. This is discovered by maintenance personnel and reported to the rest of the research team. Procedure 83 Onager begins. 34 hours. All Level 2 personnel who are assigned to SCP-1514 double-check the vital signs reported on the life support displays of SCP-1514-1A. Though the interface of the device is beyond comparison to most non-anomalous technology, it is determined that there are no malfunctions with the life support system itself. Additionally, the data being reported is accurate. SCP-1514-1B is suffering from a lapse in surface consciousness, effectively placing it in a coma. 33 hours. A request to investigate the internal components of SCP-1514-1A and possibly SCP-1514-1B is put forth to the higher-ups in the Foundation. Under normal circumstances, this would be a grievous violation of policy regarding SCP-1514, but desperate times call for desperate measures. The request remains pending as Procedure 83 Onager proceeds as planned. 32 hours. SCP-1514-1B remains completely unresponsive. It is still alive, but seemingly growing weaker by the hour. A thorough scan of security footage reveals that a glitch in the system occurred roughly an hour before the discovery of SCP-1514-1B's sudden condition. Researchers believe that an outside radiation signal of some sort was forcibly introduced to the environment of SCP-1514-1A's containment unit. 31 hours. The source of the radiation was confirmed to be a targeted microwave attack from the Global Occult Coalition, whose agents had infiltrated the bunker and falsified their credentials. Though this group of interest is known for taking a hardline stance towards terminating any anomaly they come across, the attempt on SCP-1514-1B's was wholly unexpected. 30 hours. All agents of the GOC still present within the bunker that houses SCP-1514-1A have been dealt with. Care was taken so that the security force did not cause any further damage to the structure during the skirmish. 3 different mobile task forces have been contacted in order to track down any remaining infiltrators. 28 hours. A specialized medical team who deal in treating anomalous former humans arrives at SCP-1514-1A's containment unit. The engineers are ready and willing to help them, but approval on the request to disassemble parts of SCP-1514-1A's external mechanisms is still pending. One crucial factor that prohibits tampering with SCP-1514 is the batractotoxin collars that are issued to all personnel, which activate remotely if any individual violates protocol. At the moment, these collars are still active. To act too hastily and without the approval of the higher-ups could result in the death of Foundation personnel. 25 hours. SCP-1514-1B's condition appears to be stable, though it has still been unable or maybe unwilling to send any transmission to any of the SCP-1514-2 instances. Approval for removing the outer components is still pending, though the timetable has been drastically reduced. After the close call with GOC forces and the pressure of waiting, several members of the research team are allowed to acquire sleep. Others remain awake, contacting key figures within the intelligence agencies of the United States government who might be able to aid in locating SCP-1514-2 instances. 18 hours. Both the medical team and the engineers received the direct approval of the O5 Council to provide internal care for SCP-1514-1B. An access point to the inside of SCP-1514-1A is carefully opened, with caution taken to avoid severing any of the liquid tubes that are part of the life support system. Telekinetic contact with SCP-1514-1B is attempted, but to no avail. 17 hours. Procedure 83 Onager is now fully underway. A series of robotic probes are launched from several sites across the Earth towards the approximate orbit of all known SCP-1514-2 instances. In the absence of any communication from SCP-1514-1B, the probes will have to perform the difficult task of dismantling the laser systems aboard each of the satellites. While in the past space shuttles containing Foundation personnel have attempted the same thing, there are aspects of SCP-1514-2 that make human intervention impossible. Namely, the empathetic field generated by each instance of SCP-1514-2 that causes most human beings who enter the interior to be sympathetic with SCP-1514-2, and have all other thoughts superseded by the instance's emotions. 16 hours. The Foundation probes are able to match speed with the SCP-1514-2 instances and intercept the path of their orbit. They have begun their automated procedures on dismantling the laser systems. Several of the SCP-1514-2 instances become aware of the tampering and use internal propulsion to escape the grasp of the probes. While the procedure continues on some of the satellites, multiple probes are now off target. 15 hours. With a non-zero number of SCP-1514-2 unable to be located, and several of the probes unable to dismantle the laser systems, Procedure 83 Onager has been abandoned. 14 hours. Documents from the Star Wars program are declassified for the benefit of curing SCP-1514-1B of its comatose condition. Details of an anomalous technology referred to as empathetic resonance are reviewed. The specialized medical personnel, who had never been briefed on SCP-1514 until the previous 24 hours, react accordingly. 12 hours. The health of SCP-1514-1B has improved thanks to the medical intervention, though no transmission has been made.
The outer layer of SCP-1514-1A is restored to its previous condition. Monitoring of the vital displays is placed at top priority. 10 hours. Across the SCP Foundation's many sites, backup plans in the case of the coronet contingency are put into effect. All stops are being pulled out to prevent an XK-class scenario, but most of the researchers know that hope still rides on SCP-1514-1B. 8 hours. Less than a day before the world's destruction by lasers was assured, SCP-1514-1B issued a transmission, which was received by SCP-1514-2. Relief is palpable across the whole of the SCP Foundation, but it will take another hour before everything is officially out of the woods. 7 hours. SCP-1514-1B has transmitted another signal in keeping with its usual schedule. SCP-1514-2 instances continue to receive the communication and have not shown any signs of enacting the coronet contingency. The life support system shows that its homeostatic condition is now well within standard deviation. 6 hours. All aspects of SCP-1514 are nominal. The XK-class scenario has been averted. 3 hours later, the Foundation throws a formal pizza party for the entire staff on the site housing SCP-1514 to celebrate the momentous occasion of the planet being saved. And so the Star Wars were won. But within this victory was the unspoken acknowledgement of the unlikely humanity of SCP-1514-1B. While those that had developed its components had not provided the entity with any capacity to do anything but relay messages, the entity was now proven to be capable of fighting for its life and coming back from the brink of demise. Its thoughts and feelings are able to be conveyed across vast distances to other related entities within each instance of SCP-1514-2. And what defines humanity more than our ability to communicate?
At the time of this video's writing, the SCP Foundation currently contains well over 6,000 items. This organization really gets around, from making deals with deities to containing horrors capable of ending the world in a heartbeat. So it's hard to think of this secret group ever having humble beginnings. But everyone and everything has to start somewhere, right? And would you believe that one of the most powerful groups in the world all started with a little sheaf of papers? Of course, that's if this particular iteration of SCP-001 is to be believed. That's right, we once again return to SCP-001, the gift that keeps on taking. It is a heavily contested spot, currently held by over 30 different contradictory anomalies and counting. Their natures vary from things that started the Foundation to things more than capable of ending it, along with the rest of the world and everything in between. The Scarlet King, the Gate Guardian, and the ever-eccentric Dr. Wondertainment all exist under this banner. But today we want to talk about a little stack of paper, bound by a single staple in the top left corner. Who would have guessed that something this simple would not only be pivotal in the creation of the SCP Foundation as we know it today, but could also be one of the most dangerous items ever discovered? We realize this is a lot to take in. Keeping with the SCP-001 spirit, let's take it all the way back to the beginning, to the fine oak desk of the late… oh, we don't have a name. Shame. Let's just call him the first administrator. He's the head honcho of the precursor to the Foundation as we know it today. A rinky-dink little organization with the thankless task of keeping the paranormal under wraps. We're talking a long time ago here. No lanky freaks who kill everybody who sees their face, no gloopy sadists who can walk through walls, no giant unkillable reptiles with major anger issues. This organization, let's call them the Precursors, was dealing with the real small fries. Paranoiacs reporting ghost sightings in their garden sheds, old ladies finding the face of Jesus in a piece of toast, abnormally large and strangely shaped potato chips. Okay, maybe not that small time, but you get the idea. Truly exceptional anomalies were few and far between, until the sheaf of papers landed on the dearly deceased administrator's desk. He didn't even know how exactly the papers got there, but given the number of mostly junk files that passed his desk every day, he wasn't in the business of questioning. The words "Confidential Report on Special Items Classified" were printed on the front. This made it more interesting than 90% of the files he read on a daily basis already, so he turned the first page and began to read. It was much stranger than the usual paranormal reports that the Precursor Foundation processed. No late-night wailing or rattling chains. Instead, it was a surprisingly sterile report about a bizarre and frightening anomaly. A large, fleshy, tumor-like object fixed to a set of metal stairs. Inside the object is a seemingly normal living room, but on closer inspection, all the furniture is made out of living human tissue and flesh. Anyone who steps inside is transformed into more nightmarish living furniture. The administrator gave a nervous chuckle. It was disturbing, sure, but Stephen King wrote about disturbing things all the time. And that didn't mean that the Foundation needed to be on the lookout for an evil clown. Well, until SCP-993, the sinister Bobble the Clown would enter the Foundation's radar a few years later. That's a video for another time. The administrator put the file into his incredibly disorganized filing cabinet and prepared to go home and drink bourbon until he fell asleep. That's exactly when his office phone began to ring. When the administrator picked up the phone, he heard the excited voice of one of his field agents telling him they'd just scored the find of the century, a giant sphere made from living flesh with a room inside. Finally, an honest-to-God, terrifying paranormal anomaly. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. He needed to grab and reread the file just to make sure he wasn't going insane. Where exactly did he put it? He scrambled through the filing cabinet, tossing aside the files on shed ghosts and burnt toast Jesuses until he found the file marked Confidential Report on Special Items Classified. However, when he opened the file, there was nothing about the giant fleshy room in there. It must have been a completely different file that he'd somehow missed before, because this one was about something known as the biological motherboard. The document detailed pretty much exactly what the name suggested: a large and incredibly complex motherboard made out of biological material like keratin and chitin. While the motherboard would remain inactive if kept warm, if its environment ever fell below 35 degrees, it would begin to expand, integrating nearby material into its mass and attempting to copy the structure of any biological matter it comes into contact with. An interesting and frightening prospect, but not what he was looking for. He threw this new file down onto his desk and continued to work through his chaotic filing cabinet like a madman, searching for the file on that frightening fleshy room that his subordinates had seemingly actually discovered. But not long after that, he received another phone call from a completely different field agent. This time, the agent was giddily telling the administrator about a new discovery: a huge computer motherboard seemingly made out of entirely organic material. The administrator was floored. He hung up the phone and slowly turned back to the file now laying on his desk. Those words on the cover, Confidential Report on Special Items Classified, seemed almost mocking now. Had all these incredible supernatural anomalies been reported before and just lost in his awful filing cabinet? Was he one of the most incompetent team leaders who'd ever walked the earth? Just what exactly was going on here? He sat back down at his desk, now fantasizing about the tumbler of bourbon more than ever, and opened the file again, hoping to read up a little more on the impossible motherboard that his personnel had just discovered. But there was nothing about the biological motherboard on these pages. Instead, it described a large door inside a factory and the 12 rusty keys capable of opening it. Each of these keys would open the doorway, but the key used would affect the reality waiting for them on the other side. Only the 7th and 12th keys were safe. Opening the door with any of the others would lead to a horrible death for anyone brave or foolish enough to walk through. Several days later, an anomaly matching that exact description was discovered and contained by the Foundation. All of this had been an unprecedented escalation of anomalous stakes. Suddenly, two crucial facts clicked into place for the administrator. Firstly, this file was an anomalous supernatural artifact of its own. Secondly, the reason it was never the same thing was that this strange sheaf of papers had a very specific purpose: to act as a kind of oracle, an advanced warning system of the next anomaly that would appear and fall into their grasp, giving them all the knowledge and tools they needed to safely lock these things away. The whole thing had been timed perfectly. What a miracle that this immensely useful item would appear in his office just as the anomalies would start to come in thick and fast.
It would facilitate their mission in the coming struggles to secure, contain, and protect the world's anomalies. There's a certain ring to that, isn't there? They were finding enough anomalies to start classifying them numerically, starting with the sheaf of papers themselves as SCP-001. With another turn of the page, the administrator discovered a file on a magical key that can open any lock. Not long after, that exact key was discovered and brought in before being designated SCP-005. Little by little, as more real anomalies came in, the organization was able to expand and bring in more personnel, as well as bring in more sources of funding and opening new sites. The rate this organization was expanding, they couldn't even leave management up to one person anymore. They needed to form a whole council to take over management, an O5 council, if you will. And it just so happened that just after that, the sheaf of papers revealed a mythical spring that could provide eternal health and vitality for anyone who drinks from it. What a perfect way to keep your management safe in a job dealing with dangerous supernatural entities. And things only got stranger and more fascinating from there. After that came a man with a miniature version of the planet Earth inside his abdomen, soon known as SCP-007. Next came a horrifying virus that kills and reanimates its victims into flesh-eating zombies, only capable of being destroyed with sufficient trauma to the head, dubbed SCP-008 after containment. Another turn of the page, and not long after, a frightening red ice was discovered in Alaska. This mysterious substance breaks the laws of physics and also has the potential to break all life on Earth. It can infect water supplies, and when a hapless life form happens to drink this water, their organs crystallize from the inside. This became SCP-009. Another turn of the page, and this new SCP Foundation found a collection of 6 metal collars created for human-sized necks. When these collars are placed around the necks of a victim, the person holding a corresponding controller has utter domination over their every action. It carried on like that. Hundreds of anomalies and then thousands. Years passed. The staff changed. The old guard stepped down or died. Every time the sheaf of papers were opened, new astonishing premonitions of anomalies soon to be discovered slipped through. There were plague doctors who could kill with a touch, a giant angel with bladed wings, a sea snail that believed he was an English lord, a sculpture that would kill anyone that dared to stop looking at it, a nightmarish fusion of a giant bovine heart and a scorpion capable of setting things on fire with its venom. Whatever would the SCP Foundation have done without the advanced warning system provided by the sheaf of papers? Whatever it predicted would inevitably be the next thing Foundation field agents would find. It seems like one of the few unambiguously good SCP-001 entries out there, right? Well, not quite. If we have any scientists in the audience, they've no doubt been gritting their teeth and pulling their hair out in frustration. Allow us to introduce you to a little phrase that the latest iteration of the O5 Council is very interested in when it comes to the sheaf of papers: direction of causality. This whole time, we and the earlier Foundation administrators believed that the emergence of the new anomalies led to changes in SCP-001. But this current administration has quite the opposite question. What if the changes in SCP-001 were actually causing the emergence of new anomalies? What if every time the prior administration opened up the sheaf of papers to take a look at the next anomaly, before giving themselves a pat on the back for being so well prepared, they were actually unleashing that very anomaly? Could it be that what had seemed like the most helpful item of the bunch was actually the most dangerous of them all, releasing new anomaly after new anomaly, blighting the world with countless horrors? That probably leaves you with one question. So which is correct? Is it a method of seeing the future or manipulating it? And our answer is a strong we don't know. But frankly, the current leadership of the SCP Foundation sees no merit in taking that risk. That's why the sheaf of papers has been given the Keter class designation and is kept under extensive and severe containment methods, forbidding any future research into the true nature of its anomalous abilities. Seems a little severe, sure, but better safe than sorry, right? No matter how different we are from each other, everybody has a shadow. It is a constant companion, always with us no matter where we go. unless where we go is in a room with all the lights off, of course. As a child, shadows seemed mysterious or even terrifying. But as we get older, we learn that shadows are nothing to be concerned about, just your body blocking light. Of course, at the SCP Foundation, nothing is what it seems, and a shadow is never just a shadow. Near an abandoned Air Force base in Afghanistan, nestled next to a set of human remains, the Foundation discovered an unusual object capable of turning a simple shadow into a prison. SCP-272 is an iron nail, 11.5 centimeters in length, covered in engravings of an unknown origin. The engravings have not yet been identified or traced to a specific civilization, but the research staff assigned to the object have described them as captivating but scary. It was discovered during a sweep pulled out of a rock face by a member of Foundation personnel. At first, he believed it to be an ordinary nail, until he dropped it. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, he was unable to move from the spot. He stood there calling out for help for 20 minutes before another member of personnel picked up the nail and he regained full range of motion. SCP-272, like many other objects in Foundation containment, is almost eerily mundane. Aside from the engravings on its surface, the nail looks like any other nail you might find scattered on the ground. Its true nature only reveals itself if you happen to drop it. Determined to learn more about the nail's properties, limitations, and potential unknown adverse effects, the Foundation conducted a series of experiments. The first experiment was conducted at the Discovery site for SCP-272, the rock face in Afghanistan. A D-class, referred to as D-272-01, was handed the nail and instructed to hammer it into his shadow, in the area of his feet. Once the nail was 2/3 into the rock, 01 was no longer able to move. He attempted to run but could not lift his feet. He stood there sweating and immobile until he collapsed from heat stroke. At this point, a researcher intervened and attempted to carry the unconscious man out of the sun. No matter how hard they tried, his body could not be moved until they removed the nail. 01 was taken to a hospital and administered fluids and a medical exam, and testing was suspended for the day. After determining that the nail immobilizes its victims by trapping their shadows and them in place, the research team wanted to test the limitations of this effect. If the nail needs a shadow to work, then what happens when there is no shadow present? A new D-Class 02 was selected and brought into the same Discovery site. This time, however, they went after dark at approximately 10 p.m. The nail was dropped at 02's feet and embedded itself in the earth without needing to be hammered. Then 02 was instructed to walk 10 meters away from the nail. He managed this easily with no adverse effects. The experiment was relatively uneventful until 02 attempted to flee the scene and was terminated for his escape attempt. The body was disposed of, and the research team made note of their findings. The nail does not work if the subject is not casting a shadow. So if total darkness kept the nail from working, and bright light meant it worked completely, what would happen if the light changed in the middle of the experiment? 2 hours before sunrise, the very same night, another D-Class was brought into the site. The subject, 03, was instructed to walk away from the nail in a straight line until he was told to stop. 2 hours later, when the sun came up, all hell broke loose. 03 was pulled into pieces as his body attempted to make its way back to the direction of the nail by any means necessary. His legs were yanked back towards the nail and were collected several feet from it. His torso, on the other hand, was located 106 meters away from the nail, with signs of road rash and severe trauma. 3 cleanup teams were required to remove all evidence of the carnage. The nail was removed to Test Facility 25-H, and the team decided to put an end to any further experimentation involving sunrise. Several lighting-based experiments followed the sunrise disaster, all with relatively uneventful findings. The research continued in this way until one member of the research team, Dr. Cho, posited a new question. What happens if the nail is embedded in 2 overlapping shadows? 2 other members of D-Class personnel, 04 and 05, were positioned under stadium lights so that their shadows overlapped. The nail was dropped onto a point where the shadows were on top of each other and promptly embedded itself in the ground. Both subjects were instructed to attempt to move away from the nail. 05 was completely trapped, unable to move her feet or walk away. Meanwhile, 04 was able to move freely with no consequences except for a feeling of a chill. So the nail is only able to hold one person at a time. In an attempt to see if there is a pattern present in terms of which person the nail will hold, if presented with multiple options, a follow-up experiment was conducted with 8 members of D-Class personnel. ranging in age from 18 to 59 years old. All 8 subjects were placed with their shadows overlapping, and the nail was dropped onto the point of overlap. The youngest subject, an 18-year-old boy, was held still by the nail. The other 7 test subjects let out a scream when the nail hit the ground, and were reported to shiver throughout the duration of the test. When the 18-year-old was taken out of the study and the experiment was repeated, the second youngest person in the group was held in place. The experiment was repeated 4 more times, removing a subject each time until subject 07 collapsed from hypothermia. The next experiment was conducted outside, in a grassy field near the test site. Subject 05 was placed on the grass and handed a shovel. Once the nail was firmly in the subject's shadow, she was instructed to dig it out of the dirt. 05 began digging and proceeded normally at first. After 90 seconds, however, she fell to the ground screaming in agony. A medic rushed to her side, but by the time he reached her side, she was already dead. An autopsy determined that subject 05 died of a cerebral hemorrhage with no clear physical cause, though it appears that the attempt to remove the nail is what killed her. The research team decided to take a break from human trials and take a closer look at the physical properties of the nail itself. What weaknesses did it have? Could it be destroyed? Subject 09 was given the nail and a collection of tools, then instructed to go to town on the object and attempt to destroy it. 09 placed the nail in a vise and attempted to go at it with an angle grinder. As soon as the grinder touched the nail, 09 fell to the ground seizing and speaking in tongues, hands pressed to his temples. 30 seconds later, he was dead from the same kind of cerebral hemorrhage that killed subject 05. Examination of the nail revealed a small amount of surface damage, showing that the nail likely can be destroyed, but is somehow able to defend itself against destruction. Regular human trials were resumed the next day, and Subject 10 was brought into the test facility. There, one stadium light was placed on a computer-controlled track, allowing the light to be shifted incrementally from a remote point outside of the room. The light was set up to cast a long shadow, and the nail was dropped into the shadow's head. Immediately, Subject 10 was unable to walk away from the nail, in keeping with the standard effects of SCP-6666. Then the light was slowly raised, moving the shadow. The subject was dragged along as the shadow moved, as if yanked by his feet. He stumbled and had to work to regain his balance. Then the light was moved quickly. Again, the subject was dragged along with the motion of the shadow. However, due to the rapid pace of the light's motion, he was unable to keep his balance and fell to the floor, receiving scrapes, bruises, and mild road rash. Finally, in an attempt to see what might happen if the subject was unable to move even against his will, 10 was restrained. His feet were chained to the floor and a chicken wire screen was placed between him and the nail. Then the light was moved again. To the horror of the research team watching, these restraints did nothing to lessen the nail's hold on the subject. He was pulled forward violently, and the chains ripped from the floor and his body slowly forced itself through the chicken wire, landing on the other side in a pile of tiny pieces, like a potato shot through a tennis racket. No matter what is holding them down or what is in their way, a subject cannot escape the pull of their shadow or the prison of the nail. They will be bound to it, even if it kills them. Testing was temporarily suspended while a cleaning crew attended to the room, taking the rest of the day to get the bloodstains out of the concrete. The final experiment on record was conducted the following day. Subject D272-04 was placed in the center of the room, with one stadium light casting his shadow at a 45-degree angle. The nail was dropped onto 04's shadow and he was held in place. Then the research team simply waited. Food and water was provided every few hours as well as a bucket to use as a bathroom. For the first 2 days, the subject seemed relatively normal, if exhausted and upset. On the third day, he did not respond to food or water when it was offered. After a week had passed, the subject began to speak in rapid manic screams of what was determined to be a dead language. By day 11, the subject was switching back and forth between bursts of intense ranting and a catatonic state. Finally, after 14 days pinned to the spot by the nail, Subject 04 was set free. As soon as the nail was removed, they began speaking English again. They were severely malnourished and visibly traumatized, but immediately began to recover once freed from the nail's hold. Portions of the subject's rants were recorded and translated by Dr. Kimuro, who attempted to interview the subject on the 14th day of the study. At one point, the subject said,
"I cannot sleep. The screams are heard. I am not warm. The shadow steals."
When asked how he was feeling, the subject began to tear at the skin on his arms and shout,
"I am the prisoner of my own foolishness. Let my flesh crumble like the apple whose ashes burn at my tongue!"
Not the most cheerful thing to hear, but not too out of the ordinary for a day's work at the SCP Foundation either. Following this experiment, human experimentation with SCP-272 was suspended until further notice. SCP-272 is kept in a small wooden box, hidden in a vault at Sector 25. Because nothing happens to the object as long as it is left alone, no further containment procedures are considered necessary. When the nails were moved from containment for experimentation, staff have been instructed to take extra care not to drop it. SCP-272 is considered a safe-class SCP due to its inability to act on its own. It does not appear to do anything when left alone. However, there is clearly a great deal more to that little nail than meets the eye. Somehow, it is able to wreak psychic havoc on those it traps, and on anyone who might try to harm it. The more we learn about the nature of SCP-272, the more questions crop up. Where did it come from? How does it get inside people's heads? What did Subject 04 mean by the shadow steals? We may never know. But if you find yourself picking up any strange nails one of these days, make sure you don't drop them.
It was November 3rd, 1991, and Blake Newsome loved his job. He had a passion for organization, an undying love of American political history, and was a lifelong member of the Republican Party. That's why he took great pride in his position as a filing clerk at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Or at least he did, until his horrifying encounter with SCP-1981. The worst day of Blake's life began like any other. He was taking inventory of the archive's wide array of Betamax tapes, and making sure that they were all arranged carefully and conformed with the filing system. One by one, he checked footage of speeches and addresses off of his list, until he came upon a strange tape that had no business being there. The tape looked to be completely normal, but it hadn't been recorded on the archive inventory, and there was something else off about it. A single white sticker was on the front of the tape with Ronald Reagan cut up while talking, scrawled hastily with what was probably a felt tip marker. Blake was shocked and appalled. They hadn't even spelled the president's name correctly. What poor Mr. Newsome didn't know was that he was about to see something so disturbing that he'd look back on that misspelling like it was a treasured childhood memory. Standard policy for tapes like this would be to review and catalog, or even throw it out if necessary. Typically, a lowly filing clerk like Blake would need to seek approval from his superiors, but curiosity got the better of him. He commandeered one of the library's televisions and Betamax cassette players and started watching the footage. For the first minute or so, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just the president standing at the podium giving his iconic Evil Empire speech to the National Association of Evangelicals at Sheraton Twin Towers Hotel, Orlando, Florida, on March 8, 1983. However, the second the tape hit the 1 minute and 10 seconds mark, something unnatural began to occur. President Reagan's speech began to veer off as the topic of conversation shifted from the importance of family values to the exquisite taste of human flesh. Blake was taken aback. Surely he was hearing things. But the tape only got worse. President Reagan began to divulge the fact that he enjoyed the taste of young flesh the best, particularly that of infants. As Reagan began to go into detail about how exactly one should best cook an infant if you want to seal in the flavor, the crowd erupted into modest applause. Blake started to feel sick. He'd remembered watching this speech, and President Reagan had said nothing of the sort. Things only got weirder as the president's cheek suddenly opened up into a long bleeding gash, as though someone had cut into his face with an invisible knife. As the speech continued, and Reagan's words became more nonsensical and incoherent, the injuries got worse too. His face developed puncture wounds like he was being stabbed. Skin in some areas rotted and peeled off. Reagan showed no awareness of the horrifying injuries that seemed to be occurring spontaneously on his body. This was a living nightmare. The tape came to a merciful end 22 minutes in, after President Reagan's throat appeared to be slashed open and his insane speech was reduced to quiet gurgles. It fizzled out into static shortly after, and Blake politely retired to the bathroom to throw up. Was this some sick prank or tampering or camera trickery, perhaps? He didn't know, but the tape was disgusting, and whoever was responsible had to be punished. Newsome contacted the police, hoping obscenity charges could be pressed against the creator of the tape once they were found. The tape was taken into evidence, and a low-level police investigation into the possible culprits began. While the police officers who viewed the tape reported nightmares in the weeks following, the creator of the tape was never found. The investigation truly came to an end when a superior closed the case and the tape disappeared from the evidence locker. This, as you probably could have guessed, was the work of a field agent from the SCP Foundation, and these sticks were then used to erase the memories of everyone unlucky enough to witness the tape, including Blake Newsome, who could finally rest easy and return to his filing work. The anomalous tape was now in responsible hands. It was given the designation SCP-1981 and given the object class Safe due to its easily controlled and self-contained nature. Proper research and testing was now able to begin, and while nothing about the construction of the tape suggested anything inherently anomalous, repeat viewings of the video made it clear that this went far beyond mere doctored footage of a presidential speech. Every single time the tape is played, both the speech made and the injuries received by President Reagan change. The few rules the tape seemed to always follow are that Reagan never reacts to the injuries he's receiving. It always has the same beginning and total runtime, and the speech is always corrupted. The speeches have been described as mostly incoherent, lacking any sort of underlying thematic structure, and largely being composed of nonsensical anecdotes and parables. So not that dissimilar from a regular Reagan speech, but the topics always turn incredibly dark and have included torture, mutilation, death, cannibalism, ritual sacrifice, genocide, and more. The range of injuries shown on President Reagan in the videos have included, but are by no means limited to, impalement, mutilation, and some tortures so gruesome that the details have been redacted from official files. On several occasions, the details of President Reagan's speech have also eerily predicted the future. These include successfully predicting the September 11th attacks in 2001 and the outcome of the 2008 Russian presidential election. Incidentally, this isn't even the only Reagan-related SCP to predict the future. No, there's another entity in this incredibly specific niche, SCP-095, a highly degraded copy of a comic known as The Atomic Adventures of Ronnie Reagan. The title character bears a striking resemblance to President Reagan, despite the fact that the comic is confirmed by Foundation tests to have been written in the early 1930s. The comic is set in the far-off future world of the 1980s and follows a number of Ronnie's exploits in 3 stories. The first, titled Ronnie vs. Space Admiral Carter, seems to perfectly describe the events of the 1980 presidential election. The second, Space Assassin, mirrors the attempted assassination of President Reagan by John Hinckley Jr. And the third, titled Jungle Planet, retells the Iran-Contra controversies of 1986. These comics were produced under the mysterious and apparently non-existent company Future Funnies. The Foundation hopes to track down the other comics from this company whenever possible, but they've had no luck on that front. For now, there's only SCP-095. During initial testing, Foundation staff watched the tape frequently in case this strange, corrupted version of President Reagan had any other valuable predictions for the future. However, during one of these screenings, one of the D-Class observation personnel pointed and yelled at the screen in horror. Upon further examination of recorded footage, researchers could see exactly what had concerned the D-Class observer so much. While in other viewings of the tape, President Reagan's press detail had appeared totally normal, in this one something was clearly amiss. Standing among the other dull, suit-wearing political aides was a tall figure dressed in a midnight black cloak, with a large conical hood obscuring his face. The figure didn't appear to move in the footage, it just stood there, menacingly. A later survey indicated that this figure would appear in roughly 1 in 7 viewings of the tape. This cloaked figure was designated SCP-1981-1, and he became part of the reoccurring imagery in the nightmares that often followed a viewing of SCP-1981. Naturally, despite containment and preservation attempts, the Foundation was aware that just like any normal tape, natural magnetic interference would eventually degrade it beyond use. Attempts to copy the footage onto another Betamax tape failed to reproduce the anomalous effects. That's why the Foundation has painstakingly recorded any video and audio they could via a standard commercial camcorder. In one particularly terrifying playback, SCP-1981-1 took the president's place at the podium, staring directly into the camera. The words, "I see you," appeared over a black screen shortly after. Staff members were ordered never to make an attempt at communicating with the figure, and instead contact a Level 4 superior if such an event occurs during a playback again.
The frightening and unfortunate effects of SCP-1981 would come to their logical conclusion under the watchful eye of Dr. James Kyle Robinson, managing archivist of inert safe class objects and anomalous items at Site-73. He was contacted by Special Agent Arnold Rodriguez and Special Agent Ethan Tate, members of the Secret Service with a duty to protect President Reagan. Word had gotten to Reagan that there was an anomalous artifact in the possession of the Foundation that directly pertained to him, and he wanted to see it.
Dr. Robinson obtained files and transcripts pertaining to SCP-1981 and handed them over to the agents, but refused to allow President Reagan to see the tape directly without approval from O5 Command. But Reagan and the agents were persistent. Eventually, O5 Command ordered a private screening of the tape for President Reagan at the Sanford Chemical Processing Plant, a front business owned and operated by the Foundation for Amnestic Production. Dr. Robinson offered President Reagan the use of amnestics after the session completed, but Reagan declined. The screening took place in Conference Room B, and the tape was replayed 3 times. It was on the 3rd playback that things took an interesting turn. As the mutilated Reagan on the screen began to rant about drinking the blood of a child from the skull of Vladimir Putin, Reagan began to silently mouth along the words as though he remembered them. He spoke about beings known as the Destroyers and potential apocalyptic events to come. After the screening, Reagan once again refused the offer of amnestics and departed. It seemed as though all was well, until a violent break-in at the Sanford Chemical Processing Plant that left a night guard dead. A large number of amnestics had been stolen during the break-in, and security footage showed that Agent Tate and Rodriguez had been responsible. The 2 agents were tracked down and traced to the residence of Ronald Reagan, where the Foundation came upon a disturbing sight. The agents had pillaged large quantities of Class A and B amnestics and supplied them to President Reagan, who, at some point after observing SCP-1981, had been driven into a dangerous madness. The 2 agents wanted to cure him before he caused harm to himself or others, but their bungling had come with severe consequences. Misapplying such a high quantity of amnestics had essentially destroyed Reagan's mind, and while the Foundation was able to stabilize his condition, his impaired memory and cognitive function would leave him unable to care for himself independently. In order to cover up for this grievous mistake, a cover story was concocted about Reagan falling victim to Alzheimer's and facing severe cognitive decline as a result. Both agents Tate and Rodriguez were fired for their actions, had their memories wiped by the Foundation, and were assigned new identities. Dr. Robinson, for his part in the disaster, had to face a Foundation Ethics Committee disciplinary hearing. While SCP-1981 continues to be classified as safe due to its unlikeliness to ever breach containment, when you consider the havoc it wrought on the mind of its singular target, safe is hardly the word that comes to mind. It's enough to make you wonder what other tapes are lurking out there, just waiting to be found.
The ships crash and splinter against the rock. Men scream as they're tossed into the water by the force of it, but they don't fear drowning. They fear something far more powerful and terrifying. As they land in the water, huge pitch-black hands reach up to receive them. In a place beyond darkness and impurity, all things will be revealed. Those in pursuit of spiritual enlightenment are sure to find it on the high seas of life, so long as they map out their course with precision and sail dauntlessly towards it. But their souls must also be wary, for wherever there are oceans to explore, there be monsters. It is a raining morning on the coast of the island of Kyushu. A modest fishing vessel gently crests over the waves of the Sea of Japan, carrying with it a successful haul back to the port of the rural settlement it departed from a couple of hours prior. The crew are all tradespeople local to the area, and many are parents and grandparents whose children have long since grown up and left their home village for the opportunities of city life. For the older generation that was left behind, the bounty of the sea is all they know. The marine life that the aging fisherfolk bring in is the lifeblood of the village economy. The population depends on the kindness of nature to avoid falling into poverty and is accustomed to working against the elements when it becomes necessary. Tsunamis and typhoons have threatened the balance of this way of life before, but over several decades, the villagers have proven themselves resilient to the most extreme fluctuations of natural forces. But even a firm backbone beaten into shape by hard work and suffering will buckle and bend in the churning maelstrom of alien tides.
A black domed shape in the valley between passing wakes heralds the arrival of a fearsome giant. With no further indication of its intentions, the great dark thing emerges from the depths. The fisherfolk steady their vessel as a gargantuan ripple disrupts the surface of the water, giving way to a humanoid figure that was a full 5 meters in length. When the fishing boat had left the harbor, the weather posed no obstacle save for a veil of fog. But now, in the face of this unfathomable being, the pelting rainwater swirled around the sturdy rubber boots of the crew as if the ocean below was beckoning them to surrender to the darkness. An icy blade of fear pierced the heart of Mr. Nakamura, the man who now commanded the wheel of the ship. His efforts to make sense of the horrible sight in front of him brought him back to a moment from his distant childhood. His parents had taken him to visit a Buddhist temple in the countryside, and when he recklessly wandered off, young Nakamura wound up lost in the dark corridors beneath the grounds. To a child his age, it seemed as though he was trapped in an inescapable labyrinth. The only thing the boy could muster the strength to do was head towards the faint glow of torchlight. He soon came upon a statue of the Amitabha Buddha, sitting peacefully between the contained flames of the torches. Nakamura relished the temporary peace of the moment, but his composure did not remain intact for long. A hand from the dark grabbed his wrist, and at that moment, he looked up to see the bald head of one of the temple monks. The orange-robed man's eyes were fixed downward at the boy and contained a mixture of contempt and relief that Nakamura had never seen before. Amitabha, you are found. Over 70 years later, Mr. Nakamura could see nothing in the terrible giant that had besieged his boat so clearly as he saw the silhouette of a Buddhist monk. But even with the ominous recollection of that formative memory coursing through the old fisherman's body like an electrical current, it was obvious that the monster was human only in shape. The flesh of the thing was the color of octopus ink, and its eyes, its bulbous and disquieting eyes, were big even in proportion to the giant's colossal head. Worse, despite their almost cartoonish absurdity, the eyes of the thing seemed to hold within them that same barely defined look of bewildered judgment. It was too much for Mr. Nakamura to take, and when his heart gave out, his hands threw the ship wheel in a jerking arc that brushed it straight against the waves. Most of the other fisherfolk were too stunned by the giant to properly get their bearings, and multiple members of the crew, Nakamura included, tumbled overboard into the waves. Those who remained on deck could see that the wheel was drifting aimlessly, or rather would have if their focus was not still drawn to the black monk that had arisen just moments ago. The giant raised a massive dark hand above the waters and arranged its fingers in such a way as to mimic the Vitarka hand gesture seen in many Buddhist statues. As if on cue, a consortium of black, rubbery tentacles broke the surface of the ocean and fanned out towards the boat like so many grasping hands. One of these pseudopods wrapped itself around the barely conscious body of Mr. Nakamura, plucking him from under the water and raising him into the misty sea air. In response to the tentacles, the other fisherfolk panicked and scrambled back onto the boat, with those aboard extending nets and oars to assist their fellow crew. 2 terrifying minutes passed before the apparent black thing vanished into the mist, along with Mr. Nakamura. His longtime peers and coworkers panted and sputtered, trying to make any kind of sense of what just happened. When they made their way home to the village port, the only question that seemed to matter was which of them would have to place the upsetting call to Nakamura's daughters in Tokyo. Who could bear to deliver the news to her that her steadfast father had been taken by a giant of the sea? While thankfully rare, incidents such as the sudden nautical abduction of Mr. Nakamura are not unexplained, or even isolated to cases in the Sea of Japan. Since as early as the 12th century, sightings of aquatic titans resembling night black monks have been recorded by a precursor to the SCP Foundation known as the Bureau of Onmyo. Back then, these creatures were referred to as umibozo, or sea bonds, bonds being a Chinese and Japanese term for Buddhist monk. In the current day, the umibozu have been reclassified as SCP-6781,
and because of the predatory way that the giants hunt their targets and their extreme resistance to containment, they have been designated Keter class. As of right now, there are thought to be upwards of 900 instances of SCP-2781 in existence. While SCP-2781 entities could potentially appear anywhere in the epipelagic layer of the planet's oceans, they have historically tended towards inhabiting the waters around countries where there have been a pervasive and widespread practice of the Buddhist faith. An archived file recovered from the Bureau of Onmyo reveals that a group of East Asian pirates, or wako, ran afoul of one of the creatures while searching for treasure in a seaside cave. The seafaring cutthroats had previously fired on a trading ship from Korea and driven it against the rocks of a remote Japanese island. Many of the goods on board had been carried in by the tides and required strong swimmers to access. But during the hunt for spoils, the wako were interrupted by the malevolent presence of an entity that manifested itself within the coastal crevasse. The Yumibozu, or SCP-2781, could not stretch to its full height within the cavern, and thus glared down at the pirates with an acute angle to its posture. The pirates were completely defenseless, having left behind their metal weapons and guns on the ship out of concern for rust and ruined powder. While none of these criminal sea dogs were religious, their plunder had brought enough gold Buddha statues to recognize the familiar gestures of SCP-2781. Then, according to the report, a strange phenomenon occurred within the cavern. The pirates gasped in sheer disbelief as the stone walls were bathed in light and the creature began to raise its head. The ceiling was suddenly more pliable, as if it had changed into a softer material. Before they knew it, the wako found themselves in a wondrous cave of pure gold. The entity then tore chunks of the gold away from the wall, crushing the metal with its bare hands like a chef might crush spice. A small fortune of coins dropped from between the Yumibozu's fingers, though the tempting promise of wealth called to the men. Not one of them could find the courage to attempt to seize it. This was because of the entity's unblinking gaze, which felt so profoundly wrong that even being within sight of it felt like drowning. The wako were already swimming away as fast as they could when the giant unleashed its tentacles to swallow its chosen target and disappear into the ether. Later in the tavern of a nearby port, a researcher for the Bureau of Onmyo obtained a detailed version of the encounter before administering rudimentary herbal amnestics to the pirates through their pitcher of sake, which all of them were partaking in to dull the insanity of what the more superstitious among them were calling divine punishment. While the full scope of SCP-2781's reality warping abilities is still being studied, displays such as the transmutation of the cavern into gold in the case of the wako have been noted in several other sightings. It seems as though the entities are able to perform religious miracles, in other words, exert godlike authority over all forces, mineral and elemental. The use of this ability seems to be an uncommon occurrence, even within targeted attacks, seeming to reflect an understanding on the Yumibozo's part not to want to abuse its miraculous power. Of all the sightings ever documented, no entity that is part of SCP-2781 has ever attempted to transmute a living human or animal. The Bureau of Onmyo also suggests that the overall number of Yumibozo in the sea experienced a mysterious increase during the reign of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and that the startling frequency of their appearance may have influenced Japan's inability to claim victory in the Imjin War. There were so many disparate reports of the entities that a few even reached the Great Unifier's ear. Since even the Bureau didn't have the authority to give amnestics to the Chancellor of the realm, the knowledge of SCP-2781 lurking in the ocean was likely an additional factor in Hideyoshi's well-documented mental decline. The SCP Foundation data has picked up where the Bureau of Onmyo left off centuries ago, and had begun to chart the alarming number of targeted hunts that instances of SCP-2781 have committed over the years. Sometimes the culprit is not immediately provable as an instance, but a closer look at the circumstances reveals its presence. For example, there was the case of Max Powell, a 15-year-old American teenager who was thought to have been kidnapped while his family was aboard a commercial sea liner traveling to Hong Kong. On the day of his disappearance, Max was enjoying a swim in one of the cruise ship's on-deck pools. Witness testimony says he was just present one moment and simply gone the next. Max's parents and the lifeguard on duty had no idea how to process the situation, and though both parties were sure that Max had never left their sight, the grief of it all got the better of them, and a heated argument began. Security footage from one of the ship's cameras reveals a portion of the truth, and thus the Foundation seized it and used amnestics to make sure the events were not public knowledge. There is a brief moment right before Max Powell disappears from view, where a thin, wire-like strand of black seemed to snake across the deck and into the swimming pool. Another camera feed from the same day reveals the telltale outline of an SCP-2781 entity was visible, keeping pace with the ship along its hull. It seems as though the entity had manifested in an attempt to seize a new human being as a target, but found none submerged in the ocean, and therefore had to shift its focus to one of the passengers in the swimming pool, which, sadly, appeared to be Max Powell. This incident confirmed a widely theorized belief about SCP-2781, the fact that it is only able, or at least willing, to abduct targets who are partially submerged in water. While boats are often involved in most of SCP-2781 manifestations on record, this is likely a side effect of the fact that such vessels tend to carry many humans at once, and thus increase the chances that one of them will wind up being a target. In other words, there is nothing stopping a SCP-2781 entity from choosing someone who is simply in the vicinity as a target, provided they meet the requirement of being submerged. Following the 2020 Olympic Games in Tokyo, Anne-Simone Bergman, a member of the German swim team, decided to stay in the country for a bit of additional training. She was fresh off of winning a gold medal in the 100-meter backstroke, the first in her career, and according to her own statements, wanted to make as many memories as she could before she returned to Germany, but she never would actually be able to return. Anne-Simone Bergman went missing in the Kanman Straits, and her body was never recovered. The cause of her disappearance was uncertain until recently, but in light of new evidence, it is believed that her fate was at the hands of an SCP-2781 entity. Further data suggests that the uncanny resemblance between SCP-2781 entities and gigantic human monks goes deeper than a mere aesthetic coincidence. This is corroborated by the existence of SCP-2781-A, a pure land that exists beyond the known boundaries of space and time. It is theorized that this remote dimension is where the entities of SCP-2781 dispense the targets of their attacks following the moment when they vanish from existence. There are no other known ways to enter SCP-2781-A other than being ushered in by an instance of SCP-2781, but it has been discovered that there are two ways to leave the Pure Land. The first is to transcend mortal existence in order to become a Buddha, and the second is to return to the physical world as a Bodhisattva, understood in this context to be a manifested instance of SCP-2781. In Buddhism, the purpose of the Bodhisattva is to spare itself the completion of its own spiritual journey in order to guide the rest of humanity toward enlightenment. Thus, SCP-2781-A is an extension of that purpose and confers the benefits of the claircognizant awareness upon its occupants. While it is impossible to know the ultimate truth of what befalls the targets who chose to reach nirvana, we learn much of what we know now through engaging in sign language communication with a voluntarily, albeit temporarily, contained instance of SCP-2781 that has self-identified itself as Nakamura. This unusually docile instance of an SCP-2781 Bodhisattva described the Pure Land as a contemplative place and alleged that it even had a chance meeting with Olympic gold medalist Anne-Simone Bergman during its time in that world. Nakamura indicated to the Foundation members that it wished to return to its village and release others from their own attachments and labors, but at the same time requested that the Foundation contact a woman it identified as its daughter. This, the SCP-2781 instance indicated, was its own attachment that needed to be shed in order for it to let go of its earthly obligations. We informed the instance that amnestics had already been administered to both Mr. Nakamura's daughter as well as all the fisherfolk that had been on board the vessel the day that Nakamura was targeted. As a response to this information, the entity demonstrated that it was no longer willing to cooperate with Foundation staff. It brandished its tentacles and was able to ensnare a member of Mobile Task Force Zeta-66 before vanishing in the expected manner. Further observation will need to be conducted to determine how much of a target's former identity factors into how it is changed as a result of entering SCP-2781-A, but we will be closely monitoring 34-year-old Minako Nakamura, as well as other known members of the Nakamura family in the meantime.
just in case they end up following in the footsteps of dear old dad.
What's up, explorers? Welcome back to the Abandoned Brandon YouTube channel, where we embark on the most extreme urban exploration adventures you've ever seen. We've camped out in an old asylum in England, rummaging through a decommissioned veterinary lab in Belgium, and even got lost in the underground drains of Australia. But now it's time for our most intense investigation yet. Just like my favorite Imagine Dragons song, this one is going to be radioactive. We're heading to the Bezouv Nuclear Power Facility, an abandoned nuclear power plant in rural, well, I probably shouldn't say where it is. Its location is kept secret due to the high risk of potential danger to anyone who goes there. So don't try this at home, kids. But don't worry, me and the rest of the team aren't about to be glowing in the dark anytime soon. The plant hasn't been active for decades. As long as we're careful, nothing can go wrong. Okay, you ready? Let's go.
Abandoned Brandon did not know it, but he would never film another YouTube video. The footage was seized by the SCP Foundation following Brandon's encounter with, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's just say he was unable to continue his promising YouTube career after. You'll see exactly why in just a little while. For brevity's sake, Brandon's footage has been trimmed down to only the most relevant portions, and we'll be filling in the blanks with additional details for better understanding. The day this fateful footage was shot, Brandon traveled to the Bezouv Nuclear Power Facility, accompanied by his assistant camera operator, his sound engineer, and his newly hired intern. The group had been cautioned against entering the power facility, which was located far away from any houses or hospitals, in the event that they needed help. But they saw this video as their ticket to fame. Chernobyl had recently gotten a great deal of renewed attention, and nuclear power was all the rage. Combine that with an exploration of a nuclear facility most people didn't even know existed, and it would be like printing money. Or so they thought. Getting into the area was easy enough. No one had much interest in breaking into the facility, so there was little need for tight security. There were a few warning signs as the team's rented van approached, mainly to keep anyone from accidentally stumbling onto the place. But radiation levels should have been safe in the area. There was really nothing to worry about, other than the standard risks that always came with trespassing somewhere they weren't supposed to be. That was just the name of the game, the little element of danger that kept their loyal viewers coming back. If anything, the team welcomed the smattering of warnings outside of the facility, making sure to capture some B-roll footage of the signs, written in Russian that they would translate later for their audience. Caution, hazardous materials, turn back toward main. They parked, did a quick sound and camera check to make sure the equipment was working correctly, and headed inside. Brandon led the way, swinging a bright flashlight beam to and fro as he moved. They did all of their explorations in the dead of night, when they were least likely to be caught. Besides, it was spookier to film at night, and that made for more engaging content. Just as they were about to pass the fence and head into the building itself, Brandon's intern piped up.
Are we sure this is safe? Shouldn't we be testing for radiation with one of those, thingies?
Brandon scoffed.
What, a Geiger counter? It's fine. This place has been empty for like ages, and it's not like they had a leak or something anyway.
I don't know, I have a weird feeling about this, the camera operator remarked. Brandon rolled his eyes. If you're too chicken, give me the camera and you can go wait in the van. But not wanting to miss out on the paycheck or deal with the mockery that would surely come later, the camera operator relented. With Brandon still in the lead, the four made their way inside. When it came to eerie atmospheric footage, this place was a goldmine. It had all been left intact, just as it was when operational. But with everything turned off and no activity for decades, it felt truly empty, truly hollow. There was dust on every visible surface, spiderwebs dangling from walls and beams, but it wasn't as dark as they had expected. Were there windows somewhere, letting in moonlight? They couldn't see any. As the group moved further into the facility, Brandon noticed a faint blue glow that bathed everything in a soft, pulsing light. He called out to the camera operator, demanding that he follow close behind. As Brandon tried to find the source of the light, he followed the glow, looking for the place where it shone the brightest. When he found it, he stopped in his tracks, mouth hanging agape. No way. The light was coming from one of the nuclear reactor cores, that pulsing, unmistakable blue. But that wasn't all. There were strange threads growing out of the ground, up and around the reactor cores. I thought this place wasn't active anymore. The cameraman's voice was shaking. It's not supposed to be. Brandon took a step closer to the reactor core closest to him, peering into it. It looked like there was something inside, a strange shape. Can you come here? Zoom in on that. The cameraman shook his head. No way. I'm staying back here. Fine, give me the camera and I'll do it. Brandon took the camera roughly and moved back toward the core. The shape inside. It was like the outline of a person, like a faint shadow there, hiding in the light. Brandon was preparing to continue his investigation of the area when suddenly a pair of screams cut through the stillness of the chamber. The other crew members had to be responsible for the noise. What was that? We should go check! The cameraman insisted. Brandon wanted to protest, but thought about how insensitive that might make him look. The two men headed back toward the entrance to see what had shaken up the others so badly. When they got there, they found the intern and the sound engineer trembling, white-faced and wide-eyed. We need to get out of here, the intern stammered. This place is haunted. Brandon burst out laughing. I thought you guys were hurt or something. You just got scared? Come on, there's no such thing as ghosts. But as soon as he finished his dismissive statement, he spotted motion out of the corner of his eye. He turned to see a faint, glowing, ghostly outline of a man walking down the corridor, walking toward him. He let out a shriek and nearly dropped the camera in shock. He caught it just in time, saving himself thousands of dollars and a lot of trouble. Sure enough, there was what he could only call a ghost right there in front of him. At the sound of his cry, the figure turned to face him and began walking toward him. He took a step back, but the figure waved at him, a gesture so friendly and jarring that he almost started laughing all over again. No way, this place really is haunted. Here, take this. He shoved the camera back into the cameraman's hands. Make sure we're rolling. Sound, are we recording? The engineer, still shaking, nodded. Perfect. He approached the ghost, calling out to it. Hey, we come in peace, Mr. Ghost. My name's Brandon. Can you tell us your name? The figure paused and tilted its head to the side. There was a slight whispering sound, like air rustling through dry leaves, but no discernible words. Whatever this thing was, whether it was a ghost or not, it could not speak. It turned around and began walking away from Brandon and the others. Hey, wait! He called out. He'd found his scoop, the ultimate scoop, the thing that would set him apart from every other YouTuber out there, and he wasn't about to lose it now. Brandon followed the ghostly figure back to the reactor cores, which continued to emit the same blue light. At the side of the glowing reactor cores, the intern piped up again. This can't be safe. We should get out of here. You can go if you want. I'm staying. He watched as the figure walked from core to core, pausing for a moment at each one. It was looking in, checking on the figures inside. What is that? He asked, though he knew the entity could not answer him. After checking every core, it stopped and produced a small cylindrical item, as translucent and ethereal as its body, and held it to its mouth. If Brandon did not know any better, he'd say the ghost was smoking a cigar. This is too weird, he beamed. The sound engineer suddenly let out a gasp, nearly dropping his boom microphone. There's more of them. Sure enough, two more ghostly figures were approaching the group. These new ghosts were smaller, the size of children, and they moved much more quickly. They darted around the floor, chasing each other. They ran right between the sound engineer and the intern, knocking into them both on the way. The intern shuddered and clutched at his stomach. He let out a groan of pain. I don't feel so good. Brandon was about to crack a joke at the intern's expense when a sudden searing pain ripped through his abdomen, making him double over. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and when he looked down at his hands, they were shaking uncontrollably. All of a sudden, he felt sick. Not just sick, but deathly ill. His knees wobbled as he tried to stand up straight, as if all the strength had been snapped from his muscles. As much as he wanted to stay and get more footage of these radiation ghosts, he knew the intern was right. Something was very wrong, and they needed to get out of there. The footage they had already captured would have to be enough. Okay, he sputtered, fighting the urge to vomit. Let's go! But the closer they got to the exit, the weaker they all became. The ghosts followed, keeping an eye on the team with concerned expressions, but there was nothing they could do to help. The cameraman began to bleed from the nose, while the sound engineer was coughing up blood with nearly every step. Brandon collapsed to the ground, and the intern had to half carry him the rest of the way. They made it back to the van and made the too-long drive to the nearest hospital, but when they arrived, it was already too late. They were all diagnosed with acute radiation sickness, and there was no cure. By the next day, the four of them were dead.
This incident captivated local authorities, who could not explain why the power facility had become active again, or how a leak this deadly had occurred. But whatever caused it, the radiation levels were highly dangerous, and there were strange rumors circulating about ghosts in the building. Word reached the SCP Foundation, and the location was declared an anomaly. The Bezov nuclear power facility and the 5-mile perimeter that surrounded was fenced off and monitored via security cameras. Radiation sensors were wired to alarms in order to provide an early warning system in the event of a containment breach, unlikely as that would be. The whole place, including any beings haunting it, was designated SCP-1951. SCP-1951 is a series of phenomena in and around the Bezov nuclear power plant in an undisclosed location. Though it was previously condemned and abandoned, it became active again following a series of mysterious events. The first unusual entity observed in the area was a translucent humanoid figure in the shape of an adult man, referred to as SCP-1951-A. SCP-1951-A has not exhibited any hostile behavior and is frequently seen walking around in a leisurely fashion and smoking something resembling a cigar. Like its body, the cigar is translucent. It has a habit of waving at and approaching guards, as if to strike up a conversation, though it is not capable of making any sound. These approaches have resulted in multiple cases of severe radiation poisoning and 2 deaths. The deaths appear to have been unintentional, as SCP-1951-A appears distressed when informed that it had killed 2 guards. It has also since complied with orders from the guards to keep its distance. Due to the entity's incorporeal and dangerous nature, no physical testing can be done on it. Any gunshots fired at the entity will pass through its body harmlessly, and if blown apart with explosives, its body will reform after a few moments. Following its discovery, the SCP Foundation made detailed logs of their observations of SCP-1951 over an 8-month period. The most significant entries in this log have been included in the official file for SCP-1951. First, a new entity was sighted on the grounds of the power plant, similar in appearance to SCP-1951-A, though slightly smaller in stature. This entity was frequently seen with SCP-1951-A, and due to their association and similar nature, was designated SCP-1951-B. The two appeared to speak with one another, though of course they produced no detectable sound. They also shared physical contact, including hugs, holding hands, and giving what appeared to be kisses on the cheek and the rest of the face. Though the observing researchers could not be entirely certain, the 2 entities appeared to behave like a couple. Several weeks later, 2 small humanoid figures emerged from the cargo bay of the facility. They resembled the composition of the other 2, but were notably smaller, almost like children. They were not only childlike in appearance, but in behavior as well. Upon first emerging from the cargo hold, the 2 chased each other back and forth around the grounds, tapping each other harmlessly when they caught one another. What they were up to quickly became apparent to anyone paying attention. They were playing a game of tag. As the 2 played their game, SCP-1951-A and B emerged from the ground behind the 2 child figures and surprised them. There was a sound, a low-frequency moan resembling human speech, and then the group faded from sight. Some months later, radiation from the facility triggered a false alarm, the 5th that week. This suggested an increased output in radiation from SCP-1951. When the Foundation checked in on the area, they spotted 3 additional entities, including another humanoid figure. Out of concern regarding the increasing radiation levels produced by these figures, Command ordered monthly scheduled purges of the facility. During these purges, the area would be bombarded with GV-20 EMP grenades. Following the most recent purge, all of the entities but SCP-1951-A were eliminated or disabled, with the exception of the entities located in the reactor chamber. At this point, radiation levels on the ground were lethal. Any monitoring of SCP-1951 was only possible through exploratory drones. Shortly after the purge, one of the drones returned to Foundation Base, its housing laced with strings of glowing filament. They were arranged to form letters, spelling out words. "You've left Alexei all alone." No communication from SCP-1951 has been documented since. The silhouette of SCP-1951-A, or quite possibly Alexei, can still be seen from time to time. It no longer waves to the guards or tries to greet them. It stands alone, smoking its phantom cigar, and occasionally resting its head in its hands, as if weeping, as if in grief.
Warning: this site is for SCP personnel with O5 approval. Access beyond this point for those with standard level 4 security is prohibited and may result in termination of Foundation employment. Unauthorized visitors who survive the memetic kill agent are detained and interrogated under truth-exacting memetic agents. Dr. Herman Wright was used to high security protocols. He had been working with the SCP Foundation for several years and had dealt with specimens both terrifying and valuable. But something about this site was different. The security was tighter than he'd ever seen. It had all seemed a bit too much for what looked like a run-of-the-mill warehouse in Alexandria, Egypt. The street seemed normal. It was surrounded by businesses selling food and clothes, and none of the locals seemed to give a second glance. But as soon as he was approved for access and entered the warehouse, it was a very different story. He looked into the cognitohazard testing screen, designed to cause psychic damage to anyone who hadn't been inoculated by the Foundation, and entered the large bunker. Automated guns lined the walls. He could see the outlines of trapdoors below him, and he was pretty sure the whole place was rigged to blow if a large-scale assault hit. The Foundation was taking no chance with whatever they had found in Egypt. What could they be keeping locked up below? As Dr. Wright walked through the long tunnel leading to the staircase, he could see a series of rules marked on the wall. No open flames allowed within SCP-4001. No firearms or bladed weapons allowed within SCP-4001. All writing utensils brought into SCP-4001 must be approved by a majority of the O5 Council. Violating these conditions could cause a CK-class restructuring scenario, or an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. Dr. Wright's mind raced as he entered the massive antechamber and descended the staircase, but he wasn't prepared for what he saw. It was a library. The biggest library he had ever seen, with bookcases stretched as far as the eye could see. The library was far bigger than the warehouse looked from the outside, and Dr. Wright assumed it must be a disguise built on top of the much bigger, older facility that had been discovered by the Foundation. It wouldn't be the first time the Foundation found something that didn't conform to the laws of Euclidean geometry. SCP locations often played by their own rules. As Dr. Wright exited the staircase and walked up to the first bookcase, he could swear he heard rustling sounds among the shelves. Was something moving? He hadn't seen anyone walking the aisles when he descended the staircase, and he was pretty sure he was alone here, wasn't he? Making things stranger, a quick look at the bookcase didn't show any books he was familiar with. None had standard titles. In fact, they all seemed to follow a simple format. Each title a different individual person. All books looked the exact same. Same binding, same thickness, same number of pages. Was this some sort of SCP reference library? Suddenly, a hand slapped down on Dr. Wright's shoulder and his heart nearly jumped out of his chest. He turned to see a gray-haired man in an SCP lab coat extending a hand to him.
Dr. Waylon Henricks, Chief Scientist in charge of testing at SCP-4001. You must be Dr. Wright.
He didn't give Dr. Wright a chance to respond. Dr. Henricks didn't seem like the kind of man to be very interested in what others had to say.
Yes. About time the Foundation sent me a new research assistant. I suppose you have a lot of questions?
Dr. Wright was supposed to be a researcher, not an assistant. He didn't suppose it would do any good to point that out. When Dr. Wright tried to question what it was that he'd be researching, Dr. Henricks told him that it would be easier to show than explain. With that, he motioned Dr. Wright to a nearby table, where one of the countless identical books on the shelves was waiting. He nodded at the book, prompting the younger doctor to turn it over and read the title. He couldn't believe what he saw. There on the front of the book was his name, Herman Wright. Dr. Wright looked at his colleague in confusion, and Dr. Henricks motioned for him to take a look. It was written in a language that he had never seen before, but was somehow instantly recognizable and understandable. And the book really was about him. Every detail of his life had been written down in this volume, starting with his birth, containing details that no one but he knew. His whole life story was here. From his childhood to his education to his eventual recruitment by the SCP Foundation. But the book wasn't completed. The last line that had been written described his entry into the secured confines of SCP-4001 that very day. Dr. Henricks had a mad glint in his eye.
Are you starting to understand? One for each of us. Every person who has ever lived, roughly 120 billion people since the dawn of man. Their lives all written down in these books. Every time someone is born, their book appears in this library, and their story gets written as it happens. The Foundation has been monitoring this site since the 1800s, but it's been operating much longer than that, since the dawn of recorded history.
Dr. Henricks passed Dr. Wright another book. It was simply titled The Hunter, and it chronicled the life of a prehistoric man who spent his days searching for wild game. He lived 23 violent, monotonous years before his story ended abruptly when a saber-toothed tiger decided it was interested in the same mammoth he was hunting. This must have been one of the oldest books in the library. A book for every person on Earth. Dr. Wright could only imagine what the scale of this massive library must be. Dr. Henricks explained that mapping the library was a huge challenge, before producing a map from his pocket and laying it out on the desk.
You're at base camp. This is where new births generate on the shelves, along with books pertaining to the first humans. If you want to track down specific books, you'll need to know where you're going. We've established base camps around the library to mark significant eras in human history with notable books. At each camp, you'll find generators, supplies, and beacons to light your way. If you're going back far enough, you could be traveling for days or even weeks.
Dr. Wright was fascinated by this bizarre location, containing the sum total of human experience within its massively expanding walls. But there was one thing he couldn't figure out. Just why was this seemingly harmless location featuring constantly changing books the most securely guarded SCP he had ever encountered? Dr. Henricks knew he was referring to the extensive rules he must have seen as he entered. The other doctor reached into his pocket and said,
"Let's just say that around here, the pen is mightier than the sword."
He pressed the pen into Dr. Wright's hand and flipped open the back page of his book. It was blank, the rest of his story waiting to be written.
What's something you've always wanted in your life, Dr. Wright? Think literally. Why not put it in your book or remove something you've always wanted gone?
Slowly, Dr. Wright thought back to his teenage years and recalled an injury that he suffered in a mugging that damaged his leg and left him with a limp. He nervously used the pen to scribble out the words and sentences describing the event. After a few seconds, he felt a headache and suffered from a slight nosebleed. After that, the limp and pain from the injury was gone, and he could no longer recall the event.
You see, Dr. Wright, that's the secret of SCP-4001,
Dr. Henricks said with a mad gleam in his eye.
This library doesn't just let us read the history of humanity. It lets us write it. That's why you're here, to test the limit of this power and see what this library can do for the Foundation.
Dr. Henricks soon provided Dr. Wright with footage of some of the many tests conducted in the library, and what Dr. Wright saw amazed him. The books could rewrite the laws of nature with alarming speed, as some unfortunate D-Class personnel found out. D-0546 was brought into a room with a full head of hair. The D-Class personnel was instructed to scribble "lost all hair" into his book, and he soon started scratching his head as he rapidly started shedding hair. After less than 2 minutes, the man was completely bald. D-0567, a young woman who had been brutally injured when attacked by an escaping SCP, was bedridden and would never walk again, according to all the Foundation doctors. As the D-Class personnel used a pen to scribble over the line in her book describing her injury, Dr. Wright watched as she suffered a minor nosebleed and then sat up, getting out of bed as if she had never been injured and no longer remembered being attacked. Dr. Claire Williams, a Foundation researcher sick with cancer, wrote into the book about curing her symptoms, and then addressed the camera explaining that this was her third time altering her own book. Her lymphoma symptoms had returned after several months and 2 years, respectively, but it seemed that as long as she continued to make changes to her book, then she could keep the cancer at bay indefinitely. But not all the tests ended with positive results, as Dr. Wright moved on to another selection of tapes labeled mortality tests. A D-Class personnel who was given a fatal dose of drugs and then had their death erased from their book 45 minutes later miraculously returned to life, but showed significant cognitive deficits after. Another D-Class, an older woman killed in a containment breach, had her death erased from the book, but came back deeply disturbed. She survived 15 days in containment, repeating, "Send me back, let me go," over and over again before committing suicide.
A D-class personnel killed 28 days prior was brought back by writing "returned back to life" in their book, but died again just 13 minutes later from a cerebral hemorrhage. But it was the next tape that was the most disturbing. It documented a new book that was written by the Foundation, depicting the life of a fictional man down to the slightest detail. It was carefully placed in the correct position in the archives, resembling all the other books. And Dr. Wright watched the tape in amazement as the man resembling the fictional character created for the book spontaneously generated an SCP-6001. Almost immediately, the man started vomiting blood and died less than 2 minutes later. The book carefully described all the things he died from and stated that this was exactly as it was supposed to be. The fake book then disappeared into the archives, never to be seen again. The archive knew when it was being used to play with life and death, and it didn't want any part of it. The next tape wasn't a test at all. It was a video interview showing a Greek-speaking scientist speaking with an ancient-looking old man, found living in the archives slowly after its discovery by the Foundation. The man, who described himself as the Watcher of Alexandria Eternal, believed he was keeping the archives safe from the Roman Empire and the other invaders. He was unaware that thousands of years had passed since his watch began. He had been using the books to write himself another day of life, and to cure his ills ever since he began guarding the library. At the conclusion of the interview, he asked to leave, and this request was granted by the Foundation. The ancient man died of old age shortly after setting foot out of the library. While the library can't technically cure death, it does seem to have nearly limitless ability to prolong life, as long as someone is willing to stay close by and never forgets to write themselves another day. Where did this incredible power come from? An 2005 authorized investigation into the origins of SCP-6001 revealed that under the archive's carpet is a concrete floor covered by a layer of ash. The ash was carbon dated to between 70 and 80,000 years old. And further analysis revealed the ash is likely to be the remains of burnt wood and paper, despite there being no known records within the archive itself about a major fire having occurred there. Dr. Wright didn't have much time to dwell on the library's great power of life, because he was suddenly shaken from his thoughts by the sound of alarms. Was the library being breached? No, it was Foundation officials, led by a man recognized as Dr. Lincoln Abrams, the very man who assigned him to this project, and he did not look happy. He explained that he knew what Dr. Waylon Henricks had been up to, writing in books, changing the lives of subordinates in an attempt to play God. He knew about everything, of course, because he had read Dr. Henricks' own book. He knew all of the doctor's secrets. He knew everything.
No! I'm so close, Dr. Abrams! I know I can crack the archive's rules! There's a way to conquer death here, I can feel it!
Dr. Abrams was done listening, and with a wave of his hand, Foundation security took Dr. Henricks into custody for a debriefing and likely demotion. Dr. Abrams then turned his attention to the new young researcher.
Dr. Wright, eventful first day, I gather. I'll appoint a new lead scientist shortly, but until then, don't disrupt anything. Remember, the archive is writing our stories as we speak. It's not very happy with Dr. Henricks. Make sure your story turns out better.
And with that, Dr. Abrams and his security team departed, leaving Dr. Herman Wright alone with the endless archives of Alexandria Eternal, wondering what would be written in his own tome, as the sound of new books popping into existence filled the air with ominous rustling. As history often teaches us, sometimes human beings are the biggest monsters of all. Of course, when you join the ranks of the SCP Foundation, that starts to seem even less likely. And why wouldn't it? After all, just look at some of the creatures they encounter and keep in containment. A giant unkillable lizard, a being with toothy protrusions growing out of its body, a whole host of immortal eldritch beings that could destroy reality, and one sadistic old man who drags unsuspecting victims into his own personal hellscape. Monsters are a dime a dozen to the Foundation. Humanity could never be anywhere near as evil or as cruel as the real monsters, even on their worst day, or at least, you'd think. Researcher Keltson had held much of the same mentality that the SCP Foundation had the job of defending humanity from the real monsters of the world. and it was because of that belief that he had never previously questioned the containment procedures in place for SCP-1000. These beings were a species of nocturnal and omnivorous apes, usually with bodies covered in either gray, brown, black, red, or white fur. Possessing the same level of intelligence as the common chimp, the SCP-1000s had been colloquially described as a species known as Bigfoot, linking them to the urban legend about an ape-like being of dubious existence. Kelton had hardly been surprised that Bigfoot itself was an anomalous SCP. There were already a number of others that the Foundation had encountered that seemed to have influenced popular folklore from different parts of the world. In fact, it was that unique subcategory of anomaly that Kelton was conducting research into when he came across the SCP-1000 files. He was trying to determine, in various cases, which came first, the anomaly or the legend. Did the existence of SCP-1000s inspire earlier human civilizations to pass on stories of the Sasquatch? Or had those word-of-mouth tales been somehow linked to the very origins of SCP-1000 themselves? Studying the files, Kelton knew there was a mimetic disease infecting hominids like SCP-1000. The infection meant that anyone who observed one of the Bigfoot creatures had, at minimum, a 2% chance of suffering instantaneous brain death. It would make discovering the link between the Sasquatch legend and SCP-1000 difficult, not being able to directly look at the apes. But Kelton hoped he wouldn't need to actually observe the creatures, only find evidence that proved which predated which, SCP-1000 or the legend of Bigfoot. The population of SCP-1000 was limited, although their highest concentrations were known to be found in the Pacific Northwest region of North America, as well as in the Himalayan mountain range in Asia. Being stationed at a Foundation facility in the US, researcher Kelton opted to mount an expedition to the former location. A few odd occurrences had taken place leading up to his departure. His car tires had been slashed and now needed repairing. Newspaper clippings were also left on Kelton's desk that told of various hikers' deaths taking place in the Pacific Northwest. A more paranoid person might interpret these as subtle, indirect threats. It certainly seemed as if someone in the SCP Foundation wasn't keen on Kelton departing for his research trip. Nevertheless, he changed tact and called in sick to work, sneaking away to a small airstrip and boarding a light cargo plane that smuggled him towards the forests of North America. Once he had arrived, night was already falling. Kelton was on his own, traversing the woods as the sun rapidly receded out of view behind the tree line, leaving the forest in darkness, save for the beam from his flashlight. The researcher was hardly an outdoorsy type and far from an expert at exploring the wilderness, but he pushed on into the heart of the woods, to the areas where the most sightings of SCP-1000 had been reported. It wasn't long before the torchlight fell over something imprinted in the woodland floor, a large footprint left by something bipedal and rather similar to an ape. Venturing further, the sound of twigs breaking caused Kelton to whirl around. The noise had come from nearby, making it louder than the low background ambience of the forest at night. He swung his flashlight in the direction he thought it had come from, only seeing the shadows of branches cast against the tree trunks. Then, another noise. Leaves rustling as something passed by, followed by more snapping of twigs, then the shaking of the leaves again. This thing, whatever it might have been, was encircling him. Frantically, Kelton tried to spot it with his light, when suddenly the beam fell over something tall, a hulking figure moving between the trees. Even from that split-second sighting, it was clearly an instance of SCP-1000. The momentary glimpse had reminded the intrepid researcher of an important detail. He couldn't look at them. A 2% chance of instant brain death seemed too low to worry about. But Kelton's research had described the effects of the mimetic disease to be cumulative. The longer an SCP-1000 ape was observed, the higher the chance of being killed on the spot by the infection. Snapping his eyes shut as tight as he could, Kelton was frozen to the spot, at the mercy of the sounds surrounding him. The SCP-1000 was drawing closer, enough for the researcher to detect its footsteps. His pulse quickened, along with his breathing to match. Although he was already aware that the apes weren't known for being aggressive, hearing its heavy breathing as it drew nearer was enough to make him uncertain. Kelton wasn't sure if the Bigfoot would attack him or pass him by, but by far the last thing he had expected was to hear it start speaking.
"You, man,"
came a deep, gravelly voice. It was the kind of sound an animal makes that can almost be mistaken for speech. Kelton wasn't fully convinced it had been a word, rather just his ears playing tricks on him in a moment of heightened fear.
Human,
it repeated much clearer. There was no mistaking it a second time. The SCP-1000 had spoken. Yeah, you can talk? Kelton exclaimed in disbelief. The Sasquatch didn't answer directly. Instead, the researcher detected the sound of receding footsteps. There was a pause as the SCP-1000 ape turned back to Kelton.
Follow, human, it said. Open your eyes and follow me.
What about the disease? Kelton shouted, keeping his eyelids still screwed shut.
You'll be safe,
the ape replied, before it resumed walking away. Cautiously opening his eyes and lifting his flashlight, Kelton could see the hairy figure making its way through the forest, its back turned to him. He could see it. The researcher could look directly at it, and yet nothing seemed to be happening. No adverse side effects, no instant brain death. The odds were low, Kelton reminded himself, as he began to warily follow the path of the ape. Following at a distance, he made sure to momentarily glance away, trying not to stare for too long at the SCP-1000 creature, in the hope that might disrupt the mimetic effect of the infection. Before long, they had arrived at a cave deep in the heart of the forest. The embers of a small fire were still aglow near the rocky entrance. As they lumbered inside, the SCP-1000 threw extra wood on the fire, poking it with a long stick until the flames began to reach higher. The flickering orange gave Kelton a better look at the ape. Its large frame covered almost head to toe in brown fur. There was also something about the creature that seemed off. Not unsettling, but almost sad, melancholic, like it was lonely. The researcher had been so amazed that he could observe the creature for so long without dying that he'd barely focused in on the more important discovery. SCP-1000s were far more intelligent than the Foundation files had indicated, capable of not only speech, but emotion, too. Do you have a name? Kelton stammered, unsure where to start.
Grykor,
It replied.
that is my name.
Yeah, you'll have to forgive me. I'm a little taken aback by all this, the researcher hastily explained. You're able to articulate. Your species is advanced enough to have names.
Why should that be surprising?
Grykor asked. Well, it's just the Foundation seems to think you and your kind are, I don't mean any offense, but mindless beasts. The ape made a huffing, exhaling sound. Kelton noticed after a moment that they were chuckling, a dry, almost sarcastic chuckle. It was unlike anything he had expected to learn about SCP-1000. That reminded him of why he'd come here. Grykor, may I ask something? He cleared his throat. Nodding, the SCP-1000 instance poked at the fire again, paying little mind to the human in its company. Where did you and your people come from? Kelton asked. What's your history?
Why?
Grykor replied abruptly. You see, humans have these legends, stories about something called Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The Foundation, the humans I work with, they call you one and the same. I wanted to know if that was true. For a short moment, the creature paused. Then Grykor began to give Kelton the truth, the real truth. And as they spoke, it was as if the researcher could see the story unfolding, emphasized by the pain in the ape's teary eyes.
We were like you, long, long ago, it began explaining. We and humans, we evolved together, side by side. For a time there was peace between us. But we began to grow faster, stronger, became smarter while you were left behind.
You evolved before early humans did? Kelton probed.
Indeed,
Grykor answered with a gentle nod.
we began to surpass the humans. You were still young, still hunting and foraging for food, while we were moving far beyond. Thousands and thousands of years, we were able to develop our culture, our technology, all before the humans had even come close to fire and the wheel.
But that doesn't make any sense, the researcher interjected yet again. If that was the case, mankind would have never had its chance to reach the top of the food chain. We would have died out, and that would have made you the dominant species on the planet.
We were, the SCP-6008 replied. For a time.
What happened? Grykor turned with a solemn look on their face.
You,
it replied plainly.
Humans happened. We covered the world.
Billions and billions of us. You were rare, as few as we are now. My people made technology far beyond anything humans have dreamt up, either before or since. Trains, ships, vehicles created from the trees and the animals. Communication using parts of insects and smaller creatures. Cities filled with us, where we lived in harmony, stretched out across parts of the world humans dared not tread.
Organic technology, Kelton gasped. Fascinating.
We had weapons too, and that was our biggest mistake.
What kind of weapons? The researcher quizzed the ape. Given how advanced you were compared to humanity at that time, I'm assuming your weaponry was far beyond our early spears and clubs.
The devastating kind,
Greiker said, staring ahead into the fire, almost if the dancing flames conjured up images of the kind of destruction his ancestors' weapons could cause. I think I understand, Kelton said. There was some kind of conflict, yes? A majority of your people perished? Oh, my condolences. But that would have removed you from the top of the evolutionary chain and allowed the earliest ancestors of humanity to usurp your place there? Was the disease you and your species carried a result of the war? A sort of lingering radioactive fallout, but on a genetic level?
We are not sick,
Grykor growled.
Your people lied. They made that up, and there was no war. It was a slaughter.
Kelton fell quiet, unsure of what to say.
Humans would stay away from us back then. We avoided them too. You slept during the night when we were awake, but you made a deal. A deal with something ancient and dangerous in the forests. A deal to even the score. You found our weapons and didn't hesitate.
No, that's... The Foundation researcher tried to protest, but the look of sadness on the ape's face stopped his sentence before he could finish.
We were almost entirely wiped out in a single day. Humans switched places with us. We became less, and they became more. They used our technology to forget about us, wipe their memories, so they wouldn't have to face up what they had done. But we will never forget.
And the Foundation, they maintain that facade, Kelton realized. That's why they tell us you're infected, that if we look at you, we'll die. They're ashamed. We all should be.
Not just ashamed,
Greiker replied.
Afraid. They fear we want revenge. Retribution for what was done to our people.
And do you? The ape took another pause, as if it was pondering, or just allowing itself a moment to feel sad.
We have forgiven you, it answered.
I'm not sure we deserve that, Kelton said back, as the pair sat by the fire until the sun came up. 40 years ago, a U.S. Navy exploratory vessel landed on a chain of islands in the South Atlantic, just 2,000 miles off the coast of Argentina. In other words, the middle of nowhere. Yet on this far-off set of rocks afloat in the middle of the ocean, they discovered a vast array of strange wildlife and plant species that resemble little of what they left behind on the mainland. Could this be a treasure trove of undiscovered species, they wondered. Hoping to capitalize on the discovery, a reconnaissance team of researchers was sent out to explore some of the islands on foot, and what they found did not disappoint. From endangered species of birds to plant life and vegetation that looked like it belonged on Mars, they found a dizzying array of new and exciting examples of evolutionary oddities that would fill a library. But unfortunately, their jubilation was cut short. Attempting to collect soil samples, they dug into the ground and soon discovered that what they were standing on wasn't actually ground at all. The Navy scientists soon discovered the rocky terrain they were exploring was actually made up entirely of organic matter. As per the standard protocol, the SCP Foundation was forced to silence the U.S. Navy research vessel after its discovery. With the okay from the U.S. government, the ship was torpedoed and sunk to the bottom of the ocean with all hands on deck, in the name of protecting the greater good of the masses. A tragedy at sea for the sake of preventing worldwide pandemonium. From there, the Foundation took over with the containment procedures of what would eventually come to be known as SCP-169, better known by its nickname, the Leviathan. The Leviathan is a biblical creature of mythical proportions,
said to be able to boil the seas and create Earth-ending floods with just a whip of its massive continent-spanning body. It is unclear if SCP-169 has the ability to do these things, though, given its massive size, which Foundation researchers estimate to be somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 kilometers. It's easy to see how something that big moving at any speed could be devastating for the coastal regions of the world. Although we use the word contain, it is impossible for SCP staff to ever contain something of such massive size. Surveillance and monitoring are about all we can do for now. That and hope it never wakes up and decides that we're on the menu. It was thought to be relatively smooth sailing, until one incident changed everything. Dr. Hart turned off the video monitor and faced the assembled members of MTF Gamma-6, also known as the Deep Feeders, renowned for their specialization in the tracking of deep-sea and oceanic anomalies. The room was dark, and each team member was sitting in shadow, but still Dr. Hart could see the seriousness on their faces.
"I'm sure you're wondering why I called you here at such short notice,"
he said. On the screen behind him, he put up a NASA satellite picture of a small set of rocky islands.
"You see this little island chain here? Well, it wasn't there a week ago."
He paused, rubbing his forehead from lack of sleep.
"At 8:05 a.m. today, we recorded another auditory anomaly emitting from SCP-169. This one was much louder and longer than the one recorded in 1997 by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the one known as the Bloop. Back then, it was easy to brush off as some ice breaking off of a continental shelf and scraping against the seafloor. It's not so easy to cover up anymore. These auditory emissions from SCP-169 are beginning to grow more frequent. More than that, increased seismic activity around the archipelago on the creature's back indicates that the rate at which the creature is breathing is also up. Typically, the rate at which the creature takes what we are assuming to be a breath is once every 3 months. The rate has increased to once every 3 weeks. For as long as we've been monitoring SCP-169, it's been adrift along the southern Atlantic, never moving more than a kilometer a week. That behavior is slowly beginning to change. It doesn't sound like much, but something that big even moving just a fraction of that faster means 100-foot tidal waves for the entire South American coastline. We fear the creature is showing signs of waking up. If this is true, it could mean a cataclysm for the hundreds of nations around the world. Millions, hell, even billions could be wiped off the face of the earth if this thing just flips its body too fast in the wrong direction. To put it to scale, this monster is about the size of the Caribbean, maybe even bigger as far as we know. The doctor then pulled out a decanter of whiskey and poured himself a glass, swallowing the entire pour in one go, in an appalling breach of workplace professionalism. Seriously, an XK class end of the world scenario is still no excuse for drinking on the job. We're talking about an extinction level event. A bona fide XK class end of the world scenario. 1,000-foot tsunami wave stretching as far as the eye can see from either end of the horizon. The last time SCP-169 stirred, it created the Mediterranean. In fact, the legends of the biblical flood, Noah's Ark, the same story can be found in every civilization and culture around the world. So maybe they were onto something. It is to this end I call you all here, to save the world from the next great flood. He paused for a moment as the room took in the gravity of the situation. The more we can learn about SCP-169, the better. And right now, we know squat. For one, we've never seen just how deep the body of the creature goes, or what's under it. The pressure has been too great for our current model submarines, until now. After reinforcing our Nemo-1 deep-sea submersible with thaumaturgical runes, the integrity of its hull has increased exponentially. Your mission will be to travel as far down and as close to the creature as possible. If it breathes, then there must be gills or lungs. There must be some basic biological facts we need to understand if we're going to survive extinction. Our only recourse is to find a way to sedate the creature, and if that doesn't work, then God help us all. Just 12 hours later, deep in the waters of the southern Atlantic, a massive submersible ship was diving down into the depths of the deep ocean, looking for a way to stop the end of the world. Agent JA-6-1, a member of Deep Feeders, looked out of the massive viewing port as the ship slowly descended alongside the rocky trench that made up the body of SCP-169. Behind him was Dr. Hart, sporting a white 5 o'clock shadow,
and a red nose from a night of drinking to calm his nerves. The entire crew were silent in awe as the giant floodlights of the ship brushed over the barnacle-covered surfaces of the undersea mountain. They progressed slowly, reaching each milestone in depth with caution, knowing that one wrong move could destabilize the pressure in their ship. Just 6-1 murmured the word, "Scales." "What?" asked Dr. Hart. "I've been watching the patterns of the ridges as we sink down. They look like scales, giant segments. It's hard to see at first because they're so covered in barnacles and sediment, but I'm sure of it. They're giant, armored scales, the way lobsters or crabs have armored exoskeletons." "Interesting," the doctor said, scratching his chin. "Arthropods have segmented armored bodies. This means we might be looking at some sort of evolutionary hybrid, some sort of aquatic mammal such as a whale or dolphin, one that has developed armored segmented scales similar to that of a crustacean." The doctor crossed his arms to think. "The closest thing we have on the fossil record of this magnitude is an armored fish from the Cretaceous period, but even that's way too small to compare to this. This thing has an entire ecosystem on its back." "How old is it?" asked the agent. "Well, now that you mention it, given the impossible age of the creature, an arthropod would make sense. Lobsters and other crustaceans don't age conventionally, you see. They are effectively immortal. In fact, they actually die because they continue to grow until their bodies can't hold up their humongous size anymore. And yet, SCP-169 just kept growing." The doctor trailed off, thinking to himself. Dr. Hart, still lost in thought, turned to walk to the back of the submersible as Zhe 6-1 followed. He said as much to himself as to the agent, "The creature is old. The geological survey conducted when SCP-169 was first discovered carbon-dated the specimen to over 541 million years old. As you can probably surmise, that's too old for any living being. The results had to be incorrect, and yet I checked them myself more than once. And numbers do not lie. The entity predates our civilization. Hell, it predates complex life forms on this planet as we know it. From an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't make any sense." The agent, confused, asked, "Doctor, how could something so big even come into existence?" "Very little of our planet is actually landmass. It's a wonder we call it Earth. Most of this planet is water. We aren't looking at a creature that's on our planet, Agent. We are on its planet." Just then a flurry of alarms and sensors began to go off at the bridge of the ship. The team scrambled to their stations, checking off monitors and shouting readings to each other. "The ship's thermal sensors are detecting a massive rise in temperature, transmitting power to cooling systems. We have activity northwest of our location. Sonar has something big headed our way. We need to dive now." The ship lurched forward, nose first, as everyone on board held on to their seats, the restraints keeping them from falling forward. Just outside of the viewing port, Dr. Hart could see an enormous scaled appendage moving fast in their location. "We need to steer the ship clear of the Talons. Revert all power to the thrusters. Get us out of the way," the doctor yelled. "Don't you think I'm doing that?" the captain shouted back. The ship jolted sideways and downwards as an immense wave of pressure came over the submersible, putting 6 Gs of force on its occupants. Zhe 6-1 yelped out of fear as the ship came close to crashing into what appeared to be the edge of a titanic talon the size of the Empire State Building. Following the encounter, the part of the ship bordering the reinforced glass of the viewing port began to glow bright red. "It's boiling the water around us!" one of the crew members cried out. "It's not boiling anything, it's just cavitation due to the pressure reduction in the water. The updated runes on the ship's hull should keep us safe, we just need to cool our heads. Stay focused on the mission, bottom feeders." After several moments of holding their breaths, the crew of Nemo 1 began to relax as their pace returned to a slow descent along the side of the underwater behemoth. Before long, the vessel was no longer traveling straight down, but starting to curve under the creature, traveling north towards the theoretical head of SCP-169. After several hours, the ship came upon giant fissures in the rocky exterior of the creature. These massive vent-like structures appeared stiff, but slowly they opened and closed over the span of weeks. These were the respiratory organs of the organism. Clocking it at over 2 miles underneath the surface of the ocean, the crew carefully began entering the smaller pod-like submersibles that detached from their main ship. Zhe 6-1 entered his pod and strapped on the haptic gloves, that would give him control of the pod's robotic arms. He and a team of 3 other volunteers had agreed to undergo the dangerous mission of attaching artificial chemical emission machines that could be programmed to release anesthetic gas into SCP-169's respiratory system on command remotely. The emission machines could be refueled manually whenever the contents ran out. It was an ingenious solution Dr. Hart came up with when thinking of his time studying sharks as a marine biologist. They would tag the fins of sharks by capturing them and bringing the specimens on the deck of their boat. From there, the scientists would drill a radio frequency emitter onto the fin of the shark. When he had first seen this practice as a young college student, Dr. Hart was afraid the process was harming the shark, but later he learned it was designed in a way to not be harmful to the specimen, and eventually the tag would fall off after enough data on the shark's movement was collected. Except these tags would not be falling off, he thought. They could not. For the sake of all mankind, this had to work. The doctor pressed a button on the receiver of the radio and spoke. "Just 6-1, what's your status?" "Pressure's holding, all signs look good." "Just 6-2? "Pressure's holding, all good." "Just 6-3. "All clear, Captain." "Just 6-4. There was silence. "Just 6-4, do you copy?" "All clear, Doc. Sorry, my mic was muted. En route and ready to do this thing." Dr. Hart sighed in relief and slowly reclined in his chair, watching the pods move closer to the large openings on SCP-169's side. One by one, the robotic arms used underwater torches to drill into the thick, rock-like exoskeleton of the creature, screwing in complex million-dollar equipment that was both waterproof and could withstand the immense pressure at such a depth under the ocean. As the minutes turned to hours, Dr. Hart couldn't help but feel anxiety for the safety of his crew and the success of the mission. But before long, the pods began to return one by one to the mothercraft, each completing the segment of work with which they were tasked. The last pod still working was just 6-1, whose robotic arm was in the process of rotating a large industrial-sized screw. Just 6-1 had all but finished when suddenly a low rumble could be felt shaking the larger submersible. Dr. Hart's voice came crackling over the radio. "Get back to the ship now!" Just 6-1, wrapped in deep focus on his task, replied, "I'm just about finished, just packing up my tool belt." "Leave it. Return to the ship now. That's an order." "Jesus, what's wrong? It's not like this is the end of the world," said the agent, chuckling over his radio. An ear-piercing echo sent shockwaves through the depths of the ocean around the submersible. The waves rumbled with the sound of SCP-169's voice, similar to the sound of a large whale, but amplified by a million. The sound sent all the crew members falling to the floor as the ship experienced severe damage from the burst of pressure, slightly cracking the glass viewport and sending smoke flooding into the small bridge of the ship. "Gas masks!" shouted Dr. Hart as they all donned breathing apparatus. "SCP-169 is waking up. Begin activation of the chemical emission machines. We need to sedate it now. The Leviathan is waking up. We need to stop it," shouted Dr. Hart. Just then, he looked back and noticed Just 6-1's pod was gone. "Just 6-1, what's your position?" "Just 6-1, where are you?" "Sir, sonar has him drifting off deeper into the ocean behind us. He must have gotten knocked off SCP-169 by the shockwave." But Dr. Hart wouldn't have it. He didn't want any more blood on his hands. "Reverse thrusters, turn us around and get to him. We're not losing anyone." "But the breach in the hull!" "It'll hold. That's what the runes are for." The outside of the submersible began to glow a slight blue as the ship's system started to come back online to full capacity, and alarm systems started to turn off and report normal pressure readings. Before long, the Nemo 1 had caught up to Just 6-1's pod and retrieved the agent, who had been knocked unconscious by the shockwave. Once the agent was back on the main ship, the doctor turned his attention back to the monitors, making sure the installations they drilled into the creature were functional. Slowly, the machines came online to full power, and the speed at which SCP-169 had been moving began to slow ever so slightly. The team all watched the viewport in silence as a steady stream of anesthetic gas was pumped into the respiratory system of the gigantic living myth in front of them. After a few moments of waiting, the doctor spoke. "I think it worked," he said with a smile. The crew erupted in cheers as they radioed control back up on land that the mission had been a success. The message quickly reached the O5 Council, where a red alert status was de-escalated, and the O5 members withdrew from their plan of leaving the current Earth for that of an alternate universe. The whole crew began to sing and celebrate the prevention of the end of the world, as Dr. Hart simply stood in front of the massive viewport, watching the mountainous specimen slowly grow smaller in the distance, as the submersible began ascending back to the world above. Just 6-1 came over to congratulate him, patting him on the back. "We did it," he said. "Loosen up." The doctor managed to laugh along in acknowledgement. "That we did," he said in relief. "That we did." The two watched the deep blue ocean in silence, taking in the vastness of the sea. Perhaps this would not be the end of it, but that day, they had done what the SCP Foundation did best: kick that apocalyptic can a few miles down the road. And sometimes, in the face of the terrifying and the infinite, that's really the best you can do.
Agent Friedrichsen stared at the edge in disbelief, uncertain what the nodding, twisting feeling playing havoc with his stomach was. Awe, admiration, abject terror. Maybe it was just run-of-the-mill confusion as to how something like this could even exist. Sure, the world as he knew it was far more expansive than anyone knew, unless they also happened to work for the Foundation. But even with the wealth of anomalies running around, the Earth was still ultimately finite. Not just its resources, but its space, its contents, all the people and places and terrifying monsters that could fit onto one planet had a limit. There'd be a stop to it, a maximum capacity, an edge to the world. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. Dr. Mann's voice should have startled Friedrichsen, the way it cut through the contemplative silence. But despite his ominous words, it was just nice to hear someone say something, anything, while standing at the edge. "Nietzsche said that." The Foundation doctor half chuckled, leaning gently with both hands on his cane. "Always feels very applicable whenever I come back here." Since 1944, Dr. Ivan Mann had been on more expeditions to the edge than anyone else at the SCP Foundation. 28 years had passed since then. This was his 9th trip. It would also be his last. "You get a funny feeling, don't you?" the doctor asked, not waiting for the agent to respond. In a way, it was like he wasn't even talking to Friedrichsen. "When you look down at it, like you just want to jump, to fall even, if it's just to see if there's anything down there. The call of the void, some people have taken to naming that sensation, comes from a different place depending on who you ask. I once read a theory that it's an evolutionary trait, passed down from our primate ancestors. Supposedly, it's meant to be our minds predicting if we'll be able to jump for the nearest tree branch. Or it could be a trick of the mind, awareness of being high up, making extra sure where we step, so we don't fall. That in turn makes us think we wanted to. Who knows, eh? Who knows indeed." Agent Friedrichsen didn't have an answer. He just kept staring down at the sheer drop, seeing the waters of the Pacific receding into an endless nothing space. It made the agent feel uneasy, sick, as if his very body was rejecting the idea that he was stood at the precipice of where the world just stopped. There was something else too, another feeling buried beneath the twists and knots of his guts. This was a sad place. The idea that the world would keep on turning and keep having more and more to see, but that there was nothing beyond this place. No more, an end to everything, just the void and its call. The SCP Foundation's research into the phenomenon, now designated as SCP-8001, began when a series of documents were transferred between the Foundation and the Horizon Initiative, a group of interest with a penchant for gathering anomalous artifacts and objects. Led by representatives from the 3 major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the initiative's goal is to utilize the relics they uncovered to become closer to God and reshape the world in accordance with their combined principles. The Horizon Initiative maintains an amiable relationship with the SCP Foundation, which was what allowed for the transfer of sensitive documents between the two organizations, leading to the discovery of SCP-8001. But before we deep dive into, or rather off the edge of the Flat Earth, I have a question for you. Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Regardless if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human who lives in this world who is going through a hard time, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, and this is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard.
especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/SCP Explained. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing with therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/SCP Explained. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. And now back to the insane Flat Earth SCP Discovery. This particular piece of evidence that drew the Foundation's attention was a detailed sea chart created by one Boris Kozlov, a Russian seafarer and engineer born in 1845. The chart itself contained a detailed description of a place that, according to all known records, shouldn't have existed, somewhere that couldn't possibly exist. Throughout human history, the existence of SCP-8001 was thought to have been debunked entirely, since the scientific proof for the spherical shape of the Earth has existed since as early as the 5th century BCE, back during the days of ancient Greece. Despite the Earth's circumference being calculated by Eratosthenes back in the 240 BCE, there has long been numerous fringe groups that still believe the erroneous claim that the world is a flat surface. There even exist debunked accounts from historical explorers who claim to have discovered the edge surrounding the circumference of the world. To be clear, the existence of SCP-8001 doesn't disprove the literal centuries worth of well-documented evidence about the shape of the planet. The Earth is, by all scientifically verifiable methods, not flat. So, how can it have an edge? Well, that's precisely the question that the Foundation's own researchers have been seeking to answer since as early as 1942. After learning about SCP-8001 from Boris Kozlov's chart, the Foundation was uncharacteristically unenthusiastic to explore the location for themselves. Given that the location was presumed to not only be remote, but logically couldn't possibly exist, no expeditions would be made to reach SCP-8001 until March of 1942. A vessel belonging to the Foundation was sailing between Panama and Auckland, New Zealand, when it inadvertently entered the waters surrounding SCP-8001. Reports from the ship itself described a lighthouse, its beams shining from an area where there should have been no land, just miles of open ocean. The following year, further exploration revealed no sign of any landmass in the area where the initial sighting had taken place. That was until Boris Kozlov's chart was rediscovered. It had been left in Foundation storage at Site 19 and widely forgotten about. Now, using it as a rough guide to the area, the Foundation was able to conduct more thorough exploration. Before long, in October of 1943, they discovered what should, by all other accounts, something that did not exist: the Tower of Sunset. The numerous writings scattered throughout history from people who ventured unknowingly to SCP-8001 describe being lost at sea, adrift in stormy waters, only to abruptly find themselves discovering a calmer place in the midst of a tempest. An ancient Roman sailor in 45 CE, a Chinese writer from the 4th century CE, and a 13th century vessel from India are among those thought to have inadvertently made their way to SCP-8001. Those are just the misadventures that the Foundation knows about, and there could have well been other expeditions to the edge of the world that predate their own, that simply have no historical record of them. This is widely attributed to these trips out to SCP-8001 ending in shipwreck. In 1944, the SCP Foundation launched 2 individual voyages in order to reach SCP-8001 and verify the existence of any landmass in the area. One of these expeditions, involving Foundation crew aboard the vessel SCPS Rattlesnake, never made it. The last contact from the ship was able to reach a radio station in nearby French Polynesia, but shortly after the Rattlesnake's broadcast, it was never heard from again. The ship was believed to have capsized in a fatal storm before ever reaching SCP-8001. The second of these expeditions, led by Captain Errol Meyer of the SCPS Windswept, was able to navigate through a passageway that took the ship through the shoals near SCP-8001. The vessel was successfully moored at a small island,
known as the Isle of Last Watch. Importantly, there is a distinction between this island and SCP-8001 itself. While the numerical designation of SCP-8001 is used to specifically describe the anomalous edge of the world, the surrounding area is referred to as the Isle of Last Watch. This island is now home to SCP Foundation Site-99, as well as the Tower of Sunset, the lighthouse that was seen from a distance by the initial Foundation vessel that passed through the surrounding waters. Venturing onto the Isle of Last Watch, Captain Meyer was accompanied by a Foundation researcher, Dr. Ivan Mann, head of the contingent of anomalous experts present for the successful 1944 expedition. During a thorough sweep of the island, the researchers quickly discovered SCP-8001. Since this discovery, the geological, geographical, and ontological origin of the edge has remained unknown. The very existence of the edge of the world is considered a logical impossibility, although the Foundation has verified the following to be true. SCP-8001 is not an extraplanar space, nor is it a pocket dimension. The research teams that have been stationed at Site-99 since the initial landing in 1944 have been able to communicate and transfer information digitally through the use of satellites in order to make phone calls. The Isle of Last Watch itself does verifiably exist and can be detected through the use of GPS. Rockets and flares have even been launched from the island, and these have remained visible to those close to SCP-8001's locality. The edge itself has been described as a sheer drop, stretching from north to south, situated in the southern Pacific Ocean. Water from the Pacific has been observed flowing freely into a deep void that remains obscured from vision. Attempting to get any closer to SCP-8001, especially by boat, is extremely hazardous. Unless they are following a specifically charted course through the series of nearby shoals that break up the water's flow, it can be very easy for vessels to get swept up by the rapidly moving currents and carried over the edge. However, provided they are able to maneuver safely through the shoals, ships will arrive safely at a sheltered bay on the far reaches of the Isle of Last Watch. Vessels will be able to leave the island by following the same route in reverse in relative safety, provided they keep the correct passageway. Another factor that causes difficulty with venturing close to SCP-8001 is the substantial level of water vapor that the anomalous edge of the world creates, which leads to low visibility and obscures SCP-8001 from observation. While the Isle of Last Watch itself can be viewed from satellites or overhead cameras, including any launched from within the obscured area of SCP-8001 itself, any attempts to observe SCP-8001 closer by sea will inevitably lead to a shipwreck, and trying to do so by air will cause a craft to become lost or have their visibility impaired by the water vapor, likely leading to a crash. According to the Foundation's own containment protocols for SCP-8001, passage beyond SCP-8001 is not currently believed to be survivable. Individuals who pass over SCP-8001 are considered lost. Exploring the Isle of Last Watch, Dr. Mann and Captain Meyer disembarked from the SCPS Windswept onto the island's small bay, on the easternmost part of the landmass. The edge of the island itself consisted of a rocky outcrop rising out of the waters that led to SCP-8001. Cut into these rocks near the bay was a staircase, which the research contingent steadily began to ascend. The northern and central regions of the island mainly consist of flat wooded terrain, with a variety of different plant life growing there, including different types of trees, grasses, and brush not commonly found together. In fact, most were native to continents a considerable distance away from the Isle of Last Watch's location. To the south was a small rocky area that was home to a quiet graveyard. To the west, Captain Meyer observed a narrow outcrop of rock that reached out over the precipice of SCP-8001, with a wooden walkway protruding outward over this outcrop, which could be used to pass over the edge of SCP-8001 without risk of falling. The Tower of Sunset was situated within the flat wooded area in the northern part of the island. Upon closer observation, Dr. Mann and the other researchers were quickly able to determine that the stone structure had been built in multiple conflicting architectural styles. The exterior portions of the tower seemed to be ancient Roman, but throughout the rest of the structure were examples of other influences: 17th century Spain, 5th century China, Britain, the United States, and the Netherlands, with the tower itself being constructed of a mixture of Greek, Egyptian, Roman, and Mesoamerican styles. Dr. Mann surmised that this place had been built gradually, piecemeal, over the course of thousands of years, with every new arrival to the island bringing their own influences as they expanded the structure. The lighthouse itself functions as you would expect, warning vessels of the potential dangers of approaching SCP-8001. It is powered by an 18th century oil lamp and reflector with an automatic relighting system that seems to, at some point, been upgraded using modern elements to keep the beacon lit and refilling its oil automatically, by timing when it would be running low. The main floor of the Tower of Sunset appears to be a library, containing a repository of texts that seem to have been gathered over several hundred years' worth of exploration. Each of the journals, logs, charts, maps, and diaries contained within the tower are written in a wide variety of languages from across the world, including those that are no longer spoken. Thus far, the Foundation has uncovered texts in the following languages: Latin, French, Greek, Farsi, English, German, Spanish, Chinese, Russian, Korean, Urdu, Portuguese, Amharic, and even a number of writings in pictographic languages, including the Halpul and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The oldest piece in the tower's library is a series of Egyptian tales that date back to as early as 2300 BCE. There exists only one modern electronic digital storage device, an early model of Sony-branded MP3 player. Thought to have been manufactured in 2003, this device is secured within a watertight case. However, it remains completely inoperable. It appears to have suffered irreversible water damage, leading to the working theory that it washed up on the shores of the Isle of Last Watch completely by chance. However, when Dr. Mann and Captain Meyer arrived on the island in 1944, they discovered that they weren't the sole inhabitants of the Isle of Last Watch. Beyond just those who have seemingly discovered the island prior to the Foundation, or who have been stranded or marooned there, Last Watch was home to a sentient metal construct, referred to as SCP-8001-A. This automaton, calling itself Ocheli, had seemingly been designed to maintain the lighthouse and its library, and claimed to possess the consciousness of a 16th century French explorer, one of the unfortunate people who had previously been marooned on the island. The construct was operated through a complex combination of clockwork, gears, pistons, and pulleys, which allowed it to move and speak in a way that mimicked human behavior. According to an interview conducted between Dr. Mann and SCP-8001-A, Ocheli had been watching the Tower of Sunset for multiple centuries. It explained that the name of the tower had been recorded in various writings stored in the library, and the Isle of Last Watch was a misinterpretation of the engraving on a headstone in the graveyard. It had been the resting place of a man named Jason of Iolcus and read Tender of the Last Watch. Someone who had arrived to the island believed the headstone to be a nameplate for the island itself. For now, the SCP Foundation is still yet to understand how to gain access to SCP-8001. As for how the Edge of the World came to exist, why the Isle of Last Watch and the Tower of Sunset are located there, these are still questions researchers seek to answer. When Dr. Ivan Mann later returned to the island in 1948, he once again spoke with SCP-8001-A, who told him, "Maybe there is nothing beyond these falls, Ivan. Maybe this reality is the end of the story. There are so many who believe that to be true, but perhaps it is not back of the book. Perhaps this is just the turning of the page. Perhaps even here at the edge of the world, there are still stories left to be written."
There are some things human beings aren't meant to know, and it's the sworn duty of the SCP Foundation to discover and contain such information. But sometimes knowledge is discovered that shakes even the Foundation itself to its very core. One such discovery occurred on April 28, 2016. That night, SCP-2935 made itself known to the Foundation personnel. To this day, the exact nature of SCP-2935 is a mystery that even the Foundation's brightest minds can't completely understand. Everything we know about SCP-2935 today comes from 3 doomed missions to the anomalous zone's interior. This is the story of those infamous expeditions. The nightmare began around 5 a.m. when SCP Foundation Site 81 in Bloomingdale, Indiana, intercepted a distorted radio signal. Communications personnel at the site traced this strange signal back to the unincorporated area of Joppa, Indiana, near U.S. Interstate 70. As is Foundation policy, a team of field agents were dispatched to the location in order to determine what they were dealing with. However, rather than finding anything that could logically produce such a signal, they instead discovered a long-abandoned cemetery. The most recent death on any of the tombstones was recorded as being over 100 years ago, all the way back in 1908. On further investigation, the Foundation discovered an unmapped limestone cave opening beneath the cemetery, and when they sent a drone into the depths of the cave, it appeared to quickly exit out the other side of the cave. But something wasn't right. The area that the drone was observing appeared consistent with the landscape from which it entered, but now it looked somehow grayer. It lacked the color of life of the place it just come from. The grass was dead, there were no trees, no shrubs, no animals or birds in the sky. They weren't looking at our world, they were looking at a strange reflection of our world on the other side of the cave. In fact, it wasn't a cave at all, it was a passageway between two dimensions. It was SCP-6935. Just then, they were able to unscramble the distorted transmission they'd been receiving. It went as follows. This is an automated emergency broadcast from the SCP Foundation and your national government. One or more of our sites is experiencing a communication breakdown, likely due to a containment breach of unknown magnitude. All citizens are ordered to stay in their homes as containment teams work to secure the breach. This message will broadcast from April 20th, 2016 until… At that point, the message would cut and repeat, as it had for 8 straight days. The message source? Site-81, but not this Site-81. The SCP Foundation was receiving an emergency distress signal from themselves in another dimension, a bizarre event that even the Foundation had never experienced before. Field agents were terrified by the implications of what they just heard and contacted Site-81 Command to request additional units. The Foundation wished to fully understand this anomaly as quickly as possible due to the potential threat it could pose toward the Foundation, so they dispatched Mobile Task Force Epsilon 13, codenamed Manifest Destiny, to perform the first of 3 manned missions into the heart of the anomalous zone. The first exploratory mission into SCP-2935 was codenamed Gauntlet and consisted of a 4-man team fitted with full hazmat suits and direct video and audio links to Mission Command. The team was led by a field operative known only as Agent Juno. His subordinates were Agents Kale, Devon, and Underwood. Their directive was to gather samples and survey the area positioned directly around the insertion point, meaning the other cave mouth of SCP-2935. The mission only lasted about an hour, but what they saw in there would stay with these men for the rest of their lives. After a 15-minute trek through the cave, Manifest Destiny arrived in the mirror dimension, where they were struck by the eerie silence of a place that seemed identical and yet so different from their home dimension. The first observation they made was the total absence of all living vegetation. Trees, grass, weeds, everything, it was all dead. On orders from their superiors back in the original dimension, that we'll refer to from here on as Dimension Prime, Manifest Destiny headed deeper into the mirror dimension of SCP-2935. They traveled 2 kilometers without detecting a single sign of plant or animal life, not even insects. Eventually, they came upon a farmhouse with 2 cars parked outside. With authorization from Command, Manifest Destiny breached the house and headed inside. Agent Kale confirmed that there was still power flowing to the building as the lighting appeared to work just fine, but they came upon a horrifying discovery in the house's dining room. 3 adult corpses, 2 female, 1 male, were seated at the table. A 4th corpse, that of a male child, was sprawled out on the ground nearby. As if the death of what looked to be an entire family wasn't awful enough, the Manifest Destiny team noticed a number of other alarming details. There were no signs of decomposition on the bodies, nor did there appear to be any obvious cause of death. The family's last meal was still on the table: chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. While the food looked cold and stale, there was no evidence of rot or spoiling. The team found an open newspaper dated April 19, 2016, illustrating that the family may have died a full 8 days before the discovery. In Dimension Prime, decay would already be very well underway by that point, yet here there wasn't even a smell. Instead, everything was just covered in a thin layer of dust. Command requested that Manifest Destiny collect samples of the food as well as hair, skin, and fluids from the corpses for further study. Small electronics like smartphones were also taken from the bodies. Agent Devon turned on the television in the living room and found that while most stations were now running test signals, the shopping channel was still live. Well, the feed was live at least. Both hosts sat in front of the cameras dead, but perfectly preserved. The date on the screen read April 28, 2016. Suggesting that the times of Dimension Prime and Mirror Dimension were exactly the same. In fact, everything seemed the same, the only difference between the 2 dimensions being that some kind of mysterious apocalyptic event had occurred in the last 8 days in SCP-2935's Mirror Dimension, but exactly what had happened or how remained a mystery. When Manifest Destiny exited the farmhouse, they once again remarked on the lack of all signs of life around them. At this point, the team returned to the insertion point of SCP-2935, but were instructed to remain in the Mirror Dimension while additional units joined them inside. Manifest Destiny swelled to 16 members, with the notable addition of Agent Roy as the new commanding field officer. The team split into 2 groups of 8, and Agent Roy and his men infiltrated the Mirror Dimension Site-81, while Agent Juno's detachment attempted to access the base's off-site deep storage servers. This second expedition was codenamed Overland, and led the Foundation's field agents even deeper into the terrifying mystery of SCP-6935. Accessing the site was easy for Roy's detachment. It seemed there were relatively few cars on the road at the time of the mysterious extinction event. In the distance, fire still smoldered in the wreckage of planes that looked to have just dropped out of the sky. Agent Roy and his team, like all SCP Foundation personnel, were fitted with vitals trackers, and they assumed that the distress signal that started this whole thing could have been triggered by the deaths of every member of the Foundation at once in the Mirror Universe. Once inside Site-81, they realized that the assumption was probably right. Going door to door in the administrative wing, they found the perfectly preserved corpses of everyone they knew to be stationed there in Dimension Prime. People who were without a doubt still alive in their universe. Samples from the corpses that the Foundation would later study even confirmed the reason that the bodies were perfectly preserved. The corpses had experienced complete and sudden death on a cellular level, and even the bacteria that would typically take part in the decomposition process had died with it. In SCP-2935, death was total and absolute, across all types of life forms. As Agent Roy's team ventured further into the bowels of Site-81, they made another unsettling discovery. Their own corpses, in roughly the same spots they'd been inside Dimension Prime Site-81 8 days prior. Some of the Foundation's top scientists, including the esteemed Dr. Bright, were also found dead inside the facility. In an attempt to see just how far this unexplained phenomenon stretched, Agent Roy's team decided to inspect the containment cells, where they found that all the Mirror Universe's SCPs, including SCP-2996, were dead. In his desperation to find some kind of exception to the extinction event, Agent Roy revealed a terrifying secret to the rest of his team. SCP-682, the immortal misanthropic lizard and one of the deadliest creatures known to the SCP Foundation, was contained at this very facility right below them. Could it have something to do with what was going on here? They descended into the containment facility to discover an even more unsettling truth. SCP-682, the unkillable anomaly, floated dead in its tank. Death truly made no exceptions within SCP-2935. Agent Roy's team left the site and rendezvoused with Agent Juno's team to send their research back to Dimension Prime using automated drones. Both teams remained in the Mirror Dimension for another manned operation codenamed 19. They had no idea it would be their final mission. As they descended deeper into the facility, passing more dead SCPs, they discovered one final clue. Based on the activity of the Foundation servers, the event occurred at roughly 3 a.m. While underground in SCP-2935 Site-81, the team accidentally activated the base's on-site nuclear weapon, a failsafe meant to be detonated in the case of an emergency containment breach. Due to the base's failsafe protocols, every member of the Manifest Destiny team was locked and sealed inside Site-81. They, along with everything else, were incinerated in the nuclear blast. Once again, the mirror universe inside of SCP-2935 was lifeless. But that isn't where it ends. When the automated drones returned out of the SCP-2935 cave to the field operations in Dimension Prime, they were in for their own horrifying discovery. None of the footage or information gathered from SCP-2935 illuminated how or why the extinction event occurred. Everyone and everything simply dropped dead at the exact same moment. Nobody was aware, nobody was prepared. Death came suddenly and silently, and none were spared. All the Foundation on Dimension Prime were left with was a message from one of the agents from Manifest Destiny, Agent Keller. His final message was, "I don't have any answers. I don't think there are any. I'll do this one thing and hope that fixes it. Seal it shut. You've got to lock it in here with us. I'm sorry." The Foundation were at first confused by this until they discovered a final encrypted audio log buried in the files recovered from the Mirror Universe's Site-81. It was a message from Keller himself, but not the Keller from Universe Prime. In this message, Keller described the Foundation in the Mirror Universe receiving the exact same distorted transmission that they did a few days earlier from a cave in Joppa. When he and the others were dispatched inside, they discovered the same lifeless post-extinction event world that was now so familiar to the Foundation command. But there was a key difference. This wasn't the mirror dimension they'd just been studying, but a third, entirely different dimension. In his haunting final words, Mirror Dimension Keller admits that whatever caused the event in that third dimension, an entity in that mirror dimension Keller believed this was the specter of death itself. and had followed him back into his world, and history had repeated itself. SCP-2935 was the passageway through which absolute death could pass from dimension to dimension, and our dimension was the next in line. The deaths of Manifest Destiny may have saved our entire universe, as anyone passing back through the cave had the potential to bring death itself back with them. The Foundation decided in the end to follow Keller's advice. They sealed the entrance to SCP-2935 with concrete and now kept it under constant watch, since what waits behind the barrier is an entity even they have no power to stop if it ever got through. After all, it had killed them all before, or at least another version of them. What's one more dimension on the pile? Why, it may now just seem like a simple slab of concrete under an abandoned cemetery. This is why SCP-2935 might be the most dangerous SCP of all.
Qinghai Lake. The largest lake in China is one of the most secure locations the SCP Foundation has ever taken control of. All available military assets have been gathered at the site, including 3 of the most elite Mobile Task Force units with experimental weaponry. SCP-4290 must not be allowed to open, and the site has been surrounded by nuclear mines and targeted with the Dagaz-Break orbital strike system. The perimeter cannot be breached, even if it means the complete annihilation of the entire area. This is considered to be an acceptable loss for the Foundation, since the destruction that would be caused by taking such an extreme measure is far from the worst-case scenario when it comes to SCP-4290. That's because the entity contained within SCP-4290's site has the potential to create a true end-of-the-world scenario. The Foundation, of course, is no stranger to such situations, and even has a set of designations for the various types of apocalypses, like CK-class restructuring scenarios and ZK-class end-of-reality scenarios. And since dealing with the end of the world is nothing new for the Foundation, certain precautions have been taken at the 4290 site. If containment measures fail, selected Foundation personnel and civilians will be taken into nearby emergency shelters that will hopefully survive the chaos that would occur following a breach. And the Foundation assumed that there was a good chance this plan would have to be used at some point, since at the time these precautions were put in place, it was impossible to know the chance of successful long-term containment. But just what is the entity that is held within the site of SCP-4290 that is capable of causing so much death and destruction on a major scale? They call it simply the Child. No one has ever seen the Child. No one knows what the entity is. That's because even setting aside all the Foundation's security, the site itself is still deeply protected. Literally. Over 100 feet below the surface of Qinghai Lake, a stunning collection of relics can be found. The site is thaumaturgically sealed with 8 massive metal totems made of beryllium and bronze that resemble armed warriors. The statues are inscribed with runes and arranged in a pattern designed to banish the entity kept there and keep the seal on its prison closed. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site has been there for a very long time, and it is still active, with the center of the site periodically emitting bursts of red light, but lately the bursts have suddenly started getting brighter. You may be wondering how we know so much about SCP-4290, and that it's a site designed to keep something sealed if it's been deep in a lake quietly doing its job. The SCP Foundation has access to unusual sources, including SCP-1726, and it's from there that we learned the little we know about SCP-4290. SCP-1726 is a library in China that appears to only be 1 floor from the outside, but on the inside covers over 14 square kilometers in area. It's full of a seemingly limitless amount of texts, many of which describe ancient and lost civilizations, along with some clues as to what led to the fall of these cultures. One text reveals the presence of a terrible and apparently unstoppable enemy. It was called the Child, but it was anything but innocent. When these texts were translated, what Foundation researchers discovered terrified them. They described the emergence of a beast with 10 terrible mouths and 20 arms stretched wide. It was attacked by an army of warriors, but they were quickly overwhelmed by what was described as torrents of darkness and dead geometries. They were killed brutally, and the Child used its skeletal fingers to unleash a torrent of flame. Every soul in the vicinity was consumed. Wax rained from the sky, and the Child devoured everything around it for 10 days. as the whole world trembled. But then something sealed the child away in its prison, which is now covered by the waters of Qinghai Lake. Soon, ominous signs began to appear that the child would awaken again, though. One day, televisions in the nearby area all suddenly stopped playing their regular programming and began to show images of SCP-4290, with a mysterious voice coming on over the images saying, "Repair the child's locks." This became more and more frequent, and the tone of the voice became more worried, eventually saying, "There is little time left." Further investigations of the location revealed the location of the mysterious mechanism that kept the chamber sealed, which was designated as SCP-4290 lock. But how do you repair a device that is eons old? And should you even be fixing it when the one telling you to do so is a mysterious disembodied voice that only appears on pirated television broadcasts? The Foundation scrambled to find any information they could, and they were able to find clues about the history of SCP-4290 referenced in other texts. Lost civilizations like the Shah Dynasty, the Erkshans, and the ancient Orthonians had apparently strengthened the seals during their own reigns. But the most significant findings indicated a connection to one of the most terrifying entities the SCP Foundation had ever contained, and one of the most unpredictable, the David Empire. This mysterious warlike civilization has only been known through one source, SCP-140, a single hard copy book titled A Chronicle of Devas. This is a strange, anomalous book that is written in blood and is able to add more pages spontaneously to itself whenever it comes in contact with any fluid that can be used for writing, but seems to especially prefer human blood. It recounts the history of this civilization and their many brutal conquests. While there was no proof of the Devas before the book was found, evidence paralleling the events written in the book is now being found in archaeological digs. More dangerously, as more pages appear in the book, the events of the Deva Empire are moving closer to present day, with them currently appearing in the book as having existed until 270 CE. The Devas were a bloodthirsty, brutal race of warriors. But there was one thing even they were afraid of: the child. The Devas had performed the last successful ritual of sacrifice needed to strengthen the lock not long before their currently described destruction, and the book contained enough detail to recreate the ritual. But SCP researchers would find that performing it would not be for the faint of heart. The ritual required 3 human cadavers, not a problem for an organization that's normal day-to-day operation results in the loss of multiple lives, and the live heart of an angel. The description of the ritual said that the materials would be presented, new runes should be carved into the totems. The items would then vanish when the ritual was completed, and the lock would somehow be renewed by this. It wasn't much to go on, but time was running out. The Foundation's Department of Occult Containment quickly sprang into action, assembling the materials and placing them in the correct formation. While it was not safe to descend that deep underwater to perform the ritual manually, technology could fill the role. A fleet of remotely operated submersibles equipped with carving material would carry the materials and perform the ritual without any human hands needed. One of the red bursts occurred midway through the ritual, causing radiation damage to the vehicles. Runes that have been carved in the past were also damaged, and the ritual was interrupted. While it seemed like it might have been enough to activate the site, it wasn't perfect. And when the ritual was complete, one of the 3 cadavers and half of the angel heart were still present at the site. Had it been enough to satisfy the ritual and reseal the lock, there was nothing to do but wait and see. They wouldn't have to wait long for their answer, as the mysterious voice once again took over the televisions in the area. This time, its message was less friendly. The sacrifice did not reach the 10 maws. Brace. The child apparently was not satisfied, and the lock was not sealed. Everyone feared it was too late to prevent what was coming, and panic was starting to spread among the ranks. One day, several personnel stationed at the Qinghai Lake site broke protocol and fled. None of them were ever found, but one fugitive staff member, an Agent Zenobia Marinos, left behind a note though. It read, "Do we think we can actually stop this? No civilization before us wanted to fight the child. None of them. The sacrifices won't work anymore. It refuses to consume them. They aren't enough to satiate it. Once the seal breaks, we'll have a world of molten darkness and the child will be all that's left. Eating, drinking, you're fools for staying." Agent Marinos was apparently so scared that she had fled through a portal to an extra-dimensional space in order to escape. There would be no point in trying to track her, even if she was still alive. But in our own dimension, time was running out. Foundation seismologists were brought to the site and stationed outside, and began monitoring the high-energy pulses coming from behind the lock. The energy was reportedly strong enough to alter dimensions, and the pulsing red light now covered the entire ceiling site, growing stronger and stronger as the totems started degrading at an alarming rate. The Foundation stood on guard for whatever was about to emerge, but no one knew if they had any chance against whatever it was. On August 18th, the totems fully disintegrated. Some of the Foundation's best military forces gathered on the shores of the lake and waited. 10 minutes later, something massive emerged phase out of the lock and onto the seabed, and didn't move. The assembled Foundation forces were confused and continued to observe the creature, and after no activity was seen after 3 hours, the authorization was given for submersibles and a small exploratory team to proceed down to the seabed for an up-close investigation. There, down on the floor of the lake, was the child. It was as terrifying as described, with countless mouths and arms and huge in size, over 40 meters long. The signs of previous rituals were everywhere, with angel hearts and human corpses littered around, some in the creature's mouth, but none of them had been eaten. The ritual had apparently been performed many times, but to no actual purpose. The massive being was scanned many times, but no sign of psychic energy, radiation, or other life signs were detected. The child was dead, and it had apparently been so for a very, very long time. Once the area had been cleared, teams were brought in to investigate the body in person and perform an autopsy on site. No explanation of what exactly this creature had been or what its origins were has ever been discovered, but they did get answers for when it died. The time of death was roughly 9,000 years ago, not long after its initial sealing. The cause of death was discovered too. The child destroyer of worlds and scourge of countless civilizations had died from malnutrition. Whatever this thing had been, it had been sealed away and had died from hunger not long after. One civilization after another had continued to perform the rituals to keep it sealed, never aware that it was no longer a threat. With this new discovery, SCP-4290 was reclassified as neutralized, but the child taught us all a valuable lesson about being prepared for potential world-ending scenarios. And the Foundation continues to stand on alert for any more entities from the distant past that may pose a threat today. Because who knows what else is sealed away at the bottom of a lake, abandoned mine, or in the ocean's deepest trenches. There might just be another existential threat to humanity that's just waiting for a chance to emerge and help us all if it remembered to pack a lunch. For more on strange rituals, go watch SCP-2317 The Devourer of Worlds and SCP-1337 The Hitchhiker.